All right, we're live on a Friday evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. How's my audio? Is my audio okay, brother?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Great. No, great. Thrilled to be here with you, brother. We're going to be talking about something that maybe people love hearing about. I know here in my channel, people love Mariology. I do a lot of work on Mary. One area where I don't do a lot of work in are the Marian Apparitions. Indeed, the Marian Apparitions that I cover deal with the early church fathers. And when it comes to Fatima, Zeitoun, any other Marian apparition, yeah, I'm what you would call a beginner, a noob. But the dear brother, a mutual friend of both of us, Cameron Bertuzzi, put us in touch. And then Cameron spoke glowingly of Caleb. And I'm pumped and thrilled to have Caleb here. We're going to be talking about the Marian apparitions. But here's a very unusual thing. Caleb is a Protestant, aren't you? Isn't that Caleb? Isn't that true, Caleb?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Non-denominational Protestant.
Yeah, very neat. And you are you're writing multiple volumes, right? Are you able to say that on the air?
Yeah, that's the plan as of now. Yeah, multiple volumes of the book, which hopefully volume 1 will be out this year. I keep saying that, and people get annoyed when I keep pushing it back. But it's basically done being written. I'm just editing it, and I think volume 1's close to 500 pages.
Gotcha.
So it takes a while and having to
sure.
Sort it out. But certainly, yes, the topic of miracles in general is something that's fascinated me over the past few years. And so we're sort of narrowing in on a specific sliver of that today with not Catholic miracles, but Marian apparitions, which is a segment of what I'm doing. But the topic as a whole, I think, is just fascinating.
Now, let me pick your brain and ask you, when you look into the Marian apparitions, do all of them carry with them miracles and healing that occur, or is that absent from some of them, from what you've done in your research?
So I obviously will say I've not looked at every single one of them. There's, I think, hundreds if you're counting every recorded account. In most of the cases, no, you have a handful of visionaries of someone claiming to have private or semi-private experiences with 1, 2, 3 people in the majority of cases. And generally speaking, there are not other subsequent miracles, although there are some cases where there are. And I think those ones are the ones that are most interesting to me, where you have veridical elements. And this is true also with visions of Jesus, which we don't have to talk about today, but I'm hoping to do a later volume on that subject as well, of Christophanies. So, having those veridical elements, I think, makes it more credible, because it's easier to rule out things like hallucination or something like that, because there's a verifiable element to it, where you can say, even if we don't know what the cause was, something clearly happened because there was a physical change in whatever it was. So those to me are the most compelling kinds of apparitions. But yeah, generally speaking, no, I think that the majority of apparitions, and the church would even agree to this, they don't agree to every single apparition that comes. They have to look at it. Most of them they remain agnostic on. Some of them they flat out have said are not legitimate. So it's a case-by-case basis, and that's what really matters.
And from the research that I have done, and maybe you can confirm this because you've done much more on this topic, on these topics, from what I've gathered, the church has been quite meticulous each time that they dive in and do research before ever affirming any of them. Isn't that correct? There's a meticulous amount of research done.
Yeah, certainly compared to, I think, any other religion, there's really nothing comparable to the Catholic method of looking into miracles in general. And a lot of that comes out of the Council of Trent, right, in the 16th century, to combat the Protestant Reformation. A lot of Protestants were criticizing Catholics, among other things, for being overly charismatic and overly willing to believe in miracles and relics. And granted, a lot of those criticisms, I think, were fair, where you did have some bishops and priests who were selling the crown of thorns or whatever they said, and people believed in pilgrim and give them money. There was certainly a lot of corruption at the time. And so the church wanted to swing the hammer down and say, well, we don't just want any other cult who thinks that this particular person's a saint because maybe they have kind of sketchy theology. So we need to have a very rigorous process of approving these things so that you don't get to sign off on it until you've actually had this step-by-step method. They actually just recently changed the parameters of that too, but a lot of that comes out of the Council of Trent. And you see a lot of that being revised as well with the Enlightenment. The most influential pope on this was Prospero Lambertini, who is Pope Urban XIV later on, back when he was a cardinal. And he came up with the Lambertini criteria. And he's most responsible for the modern day canonization rules that are still used for that. It's kind of crazy to think about. A lot of people don't realize that the Catholic Church is still on an annual basis declaring miracles of saints. And
Yes.
it's kind of funny that it doesn't really get that much attention. You think that conversation of religion and debating atheism and all this stuff, or Protestantism, that the conversation of, oh, what was the miracle of the month or whatever that was declared.
Yeah.
Right. So for people who ask why that stuff doesn't happen today, usually my first inclination is to say, well, how much have you actually looked into it? Because, here's a whole sample of hundreds of cases. I'm not saying that all of them are legitimate, but if even 1% of those are compelling, then that gives you a good place to start your investigation.
Sure, no doubt. And interestingly enough, we've got issue even in the 4th century. Perhaps people can find examples beforehand, but I have found examples in the 4th century where you even have early fathers quite upset that there are people that are claiming to have relics of the true cross in many different areas. And the fathers seem to be very frustrated that people are abusing relics even then. So abuses have been around for quite a while. And we're thankful that the Council of Trent really brought that banhammer down on that. And the church is very meticulous today, which is a particular reason why not every apparition is approved. And much to the chagrin of some people who want they want their favorite apparition approved immediately. But I'm under the impression we're going to talk about some today that are, or I'm not sure exactly which ones you want to talk about today, but there's one that has been on my radar for a long time. That's Zeitoun. And it came right back to the front and center because of Cameron did a video recently. And a number of people have been talking about it. And it's one area where I've done very, very little research. Now, you've done the heavy work here. What other particular apparitions do you want to talk about today other than that one?
Yeah, well, I had some stuff on Zeitoun if we want to talk about it. Interestingly, Zeitoun is not actually, it's one of the more interesting ones, but it's also not a Catholic, at least an explicitly Catholic one. It's technically a Coptic Orthodox one if you want to look at the context, which might, not make some Catholics happy, but sometimes they'll take what they can get. Say, well, it's still high Mariology, so it's still more consistent than most Protestant sects in that way. But yeah, for me, the most compelling ones besides Fatima would be the ones I think that have these sort of vertical elements that I mentioned earlier. And sometimes the healings themselves, the apparitions themselves don't have that, but the visionaries who have them or the healings that accompanied them are what are compelling. So I particularly had on here Lourdes, or Lourdes if you speak American English.
Right.
Which I think is one of the most compelling, not just for the apparition, which could be kind of go either way in terms of legitimacy of, but the miracles that go by it are not only really impressive, but it's probably the best example you have in the modern world of this rigorous investigation. It's even more rigorous than the Catholic canonization of saints. Lourdes is to that degree. So that's one of them. Some of the other ones like Maggiore is very controversial. I think the apparitions themselves are quite questionable. The church hasn't had a firm stance on it, but there were again some healings associated with it that are really interesting. And there are other ones that are not as well known, like it's spelled like Buerang, but I think it's pronounced Buerang in Belgium in the 1930s. Had some interesting elements to it. One of my favorite ones that we can start off with that is quite a bit older. You actually might know this if you, I know you like the older ancient church historians, but do you know what the first official Marian apparition was according to tradition? Out of curiosity.
Well, I'm very well aware of the first one that I have been able to catalog, and that would be the one of Holy Mother Mary and St. John appearing to St. Gregor the Wonder Worker. I don't know if you've, I know that there is another one dated to much earlier. I don't know how good the evidence is for it, though, but maybe you, which one are you talking about?
Well, I was going to say Our Lady of the Pillar, which is supposed to be 40 AD, right? And that might be, that's the earliest alleged date.
Yes.
Now, sure, the historical evidence for that is not
right. I couldn't find anything very early on that, and being a patristic guy and being a guy that looks into documentation, I'm very well aware of the early dating of it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find very early evidence of it, so I stick with the one to St. Gregor the Wonder Worker, which I'm pretty sure you've heard of that one as well.
Yeah, vaguely. I haven't looked into that one as much, but that is true. But I bring up Our Lady of the Pillar. Not first of all, it's interesting because according to tradition, again, I don't think the historicity on this is very certified.
Sure.
But you do have this apparently happened while Mary was still alive in 40 AD. This was sort of a biolocation. She appeared to James, allegedly, the apostle. Now, although the history of that is sketchy, this allegedly occurred in Spain. There is a miracle associated with it over millennia later that is very interesting. And it's not as well known as you would think it would be, but I have been doing quite a lot these past few years to popularize this, because I think it's one of the most interesting miracles in history. And I don't even say that lightly.
Right.
Thank you for that, Ralph. I appreciate that. Yeah. I, by the way, I'm not an expert in terms of scholarship. This is completely a hobby of mine. I've just spent years looking at it as an autodidact.
We're thrilled to have you here, brother. We're thrilled to have you here.
I appreciate that. Being friends with people like you and Cameron, they'll open me up to a lot of networking and a lot of ways of looking at it. So I appreciate every opportunity I can get.
Absolutely.
But Our Lady of the Pillar has a really interesting miracle associated with it in the 1600s. Now, people often think, well, 1600s, that's forever ago. How could you possibly verify anything from back then, right? But the contemporary sources we have for this particular miracle are really interesting, because they're only written, the earliest ones we have are just a few days after the event, right after the printing press was invented. These were printed widely. And the nature of the miracle was, I think, so fascinating that it's kind of hard to ignore. So to give you just a brief version of this, and again, I've done lots of material on this on YouTube. Jimmy Akin did a show about this with some material that I gave him, and this will be one of the
I didn't know that. Wow.
Absolutely. And this will be one of the volumes that I do later on. But the tradition, it's not a tradition. The accounts go that there was a young farmer named Miguel Piercer. This is in Spain in the year 1637. He breaks his leg in a farming accident. A big wheel on a cart rolls over him and breaks his leg. He goes to a doctor in his hometown of Calanda, but they can't do anything to fix it. So he has to get crutches and travel about 40 miles south to Zaragoza, which is a bigger city. And this is where they have this big cathedral to Our Lady of the Pillar, right? This Marian Apparition that the town vindicates and venerates. So he goes there. At that point, his leg is gangrened. They can't do anything to save it. And medicine back then wasn't the best, right? So they have to go and saw his leg off. And they didn't have an anesthetic, so he just got really drunk. They sawed his leg off, took a hot iron and casted it, stopped the bleeding. He then was in the hospital. This I believe was in August of 1637. He was in the hospital till about that spring, roughly March, April, where he went out and became a licensed beggar. You had to get a license back then to beg, and they expect you to have another job. So he would beg in front of this big church dedicated to Our Lady of the Pillar, where he would collect donations. And he did this for 2.5 years. Usually he would sleep outside the hospital. Sometimes he would get enough money to stay in the local inn, but he was essentially homeless.
Wow.
In this way. So 2.5 years later, he eventually gets the courage, after he talks to a priest who knew him from back home, to say, why don't you go back to your family and see them and stop living, like this. So he has to, through a very long process of asking for help, getting on carts, moving around. It takes him about a week to get back home. You can imagine how hard that is doing it. His family sees that he now has one leg and they're devastated. They're all touching him, all that stuff. So he hangs out with them. But one night, as he's laying there, he feels sick and goes up to sleep for the night, right? Now, I should mention back that when he was begging back in Zaragoza, he would constantly take the oil from the lamps and rub it on his stump and ask the Virgin Mary to heal him. And his doctors would get very annoyed at this. They thought it'd cause an infection, to say you shouldn't just be taking lamp oil and putting it on I guess it was an open sore, but still, that it wouldn't be healthy, right? But anyway, he would do that frequently. So that's the context. So he goes back up, back when he's home in Calanda, to his room for the night. His mother walks up there a few hours later, and she notices in his bed, he's sleeping with a coat because they didn't have enough blankets. There was a soldier in the bed next to them, because back in the day, traveling soldiers would sometimes be housed in people's houses. So she sees two legs sticking out, and at first she thinks it's one of the soldiers, but she looks over and sees the soldier in his bed and realizes that her son has two legs now. So she's panics, wakes him up, and he's groggy, and he's like, sorry, I just had a dream that the Virgin Mary came and was rubbing my leg, right? Our Lady of the Pillar. And then he looks down and sees that he has a second leg and freaks out in this way. So all the town goes crazy. They see this. 3 days later, a notary comes and they get the testimony of the 10 witnesses who claim that all neighbors of Miguel Piercer. This then goes to the Bishop of Zaragoza. Miguel and his family go back to Zaragoza, where everyone who saw him as a beggar, including the church attendees, were amazed by this. And so they have an investigation into this. And this is where they have a list of 24 witnesses, and the transcript is still available to this day if you want to read it. It is in Spanish, but it's there. And the transcript goes down the line and gives the name, occupation of each witness who testifies to this. Some of them were neighbors, some of them were attendees. I think 5 of them were hospital attendees. 2 of them were the surgeons who actually cut the leg off. One of them was one of the hospital staffers who buried it. One of them was who cauterized it. They all say, yes, I swear under oath that on this date, I cut the leg off and then I buried it and all this stuff. And I can testify this is the same man we saw at this point, right? Wow. So this is a pretty amazing miracle in that sense. And affiliated with Virgin Mary, right? So although the Virgin Mary didn't actually appear in this case, at least visibly to anyone, maybe in dreams, the miracle associated with this led to Our Lady of the Pillar being the patron saint, or the patron dignitary of Zaragoza, Spain, a few years later after this. Wow. So I go through all the objections and all the other considerations and some of the other materials if you're curious, but that's sort of a rundown where
that's amazing.
This amputee miracle that every atheist always asks about, of why doesn't God ever do something visually obvious, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, there's one. So,
that's amazing. I did not know about that. And so you have even done the work and noted that there is a paper trail of witnesses and names. And when you've got that really does lend to the credibility.
The date and time. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, when you compare this to like the resurrection, for example, even if you were very conservative and say the resurrection was written, the gospels were written by eyewitnesses, which a lot of people contend against, you still have them writing decades later. And there's questions about, who wrote it and all this stuff in the time period. But with this case, which is a lot more recent comparatively, after the printing press was invented, you have named witnesses at the time. We can tell you that this miracle allegedly happened about 10 o'clock p.m. on March 30th, 1640 in this house. Like, it's pretty dang specific. So it's pretty incredible that we have that much information. So whether or not one believes it or not, the fact that this is a very big miracle, I think deserves more attention. And it's very hard to find any sources in English on this. And so I've made it one of my tasks to try to make this more well-known. And so far as I can tell, I put more material out on this in English than anyone else has. Everything else is in Spanish or French or Portuguese or Italian. So, it was a very long task, but I think it's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say on that miracle is that it's funny because if you know David Hume, who wrote a whole essay on miracles.
Oh yeah,
right.
I know that.
He's writing against Protestants in that way, and he's trying to point out to all these Catholic miracles that the Protestants don't believe in, and say, well, look, we have living witnesses to these, and you reject these, but you believe in the resurrection, which is further along, right? Further we'll go. And he points to this example. He actually talks about, we all know the story of the man in Zaragoza who got his leg back after praying to the Virgin Mary, and we have so many witnesses who attest to this. But we know this couldn't have possibly happened. So obviously the resurrection didn't happen. And he just dismisses it. He actually goes as far to say that there was a particular cardinal who came there and sort of just believed this because everyone in the town told him about this. And he didn't bother to investigate it. And Hume says, and good for him to just dismiss this, because he doesn't even need to look into this because we know this can't happen. So there's no point in even looking into the evidence.
Wow.
so it's a very, very much a dismissal of the credibility of that, but it is fascinating to see that used in that kind of dialogue.
Now, Caleb, I'm thinking about this because I am a convert from Protestantism. And before I became Catholic, I, of course, was very anti-Mary in pretty much everything. Thinking back to my Protestant days, and today I cringe. I think it's a very low-level argument, but you're going to hear it very often. And I can think of William back when William was a Protestant. He's going to say, Caleb, but this is just the work of the devil to draw people away from Christ. How can you even believe any of this ever occurred? Clearly, this is the work of the devil to draw people into believing things that are false. Have you ever heard that?
Unfortunately, yes. I hear it quite often, and I think it's very intellectually lazy, to be honest, to have a worldview where any potentially falsifying view that could be evidence against position, you can just say, well, that's just a deceptive spirit. I think that opens you up to a very dangerous Pandora's box where a Jew can make the same argument. In fact, people did make that argument with Jesus to say, this is Beelzebub. This is that the Jews can point to Deuteronomy where it says that if anyone does miracles and claims different religion, then you should stone him as a false prophet, right? So there could have been Jews who said that this devil raised Jesus from the dead. In fact, Celsus, the famous 2nd century opponent of Christianity, who
Origen wrote against him.
Absolutely. Celsus talks about how the Christians are possessed with demonic power and how the apostles and Jesus learned magic in Egypt. And this is where they developed their skills, right? They appealed to dark forces. So anyone can pull this argument, and I don't think it's very persuasive. And if anything, it's going to just open you up to the same kind of objection. Nor do I think it's really consistent either, because I don't know if you've ever read, you probably have read C.S. Lewis, right? If you're a big fan. Yeah, of course.
Definitely.
I recall in the Screw Tape Letters, I think it was, where he has one of the demons talk about how, we don't want him to believe in the devil because then they're going to believe in God. So it's better to get them to doubt that existence, more of a secular mindset in that way. And that to me makes sense in terms of that's how the devil would operate. I don't think the devil would want to do something that would be evidence of the supernatural and religious context and get people looking into Christianity, especially with Zeitoun, which I know we haven't gotten to yet, but that's a case where lots of Muslims converted to Coptic Christianity. So unless one thinks that Roman Catholics are just blatantly idolatrous and anti-Christian, which there are some who think that, like Matt Slick. But
I know that.
I know you've talked to him. Yeah, no, I'm very much aware you're aware of that. But for most Protestants who think that Catholics are just other brothers in Christ with disagreements, I don't see how this kind of deception is going to lead people to sin. I think if anything, you're just increasing the probability that people are going to be compelled by supernaturalism in this sense, right? So I don't think it's a very good objection.
I don't either. And you described it perfectly. You were much kinder than I was when you noted that it was intellectually lazy. I was going to say it's very low IQ, but we're pretty much saying the same thing. Sure. I just cannot fathom how the devil would try to bring people closer to Christ. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It really doesn't.
Yeah, it is. And I even use that when people talk about like Islam, like, oh, Muhammad, saw Satan. Yeah. Oh, thank you, XJW Lord. That's nice. I'm not saying that can't happen. I know Paul talks about angels of light, but I think that we should look at other explanations before always just going to the divine.
No doubt. 100%. Yes, I completely agree. But that now you have opened you've opened up my interest into looking at Our Lady of the Pillar. I got to look at that. I really do, because that's one thing that sadly, I kind of dismissed it because I didn't think we had anything to look at there. But now let me ask you this, Caleb, and I'll give you a chance before our show is done to promote a webpage or anything you may have. Do you have anything online that people can look at on that topic?
Sure. So I have, in terms of YouTube, I did a video called "Does God Heal Amputees?" Jimmy Akin did a video on this. If you just look up the Miracle of Calanda, you'll see quite a few podcast videos I've been on talking about this. If you want a written source, right now, I did a blog article on Think Christian Theism. If you want to look at that, we can put it in the description later on the topic for a popularized, shorter version of it. I will hopefully be having a much more extended version with all the primary sources cited in one of the probably volume 2 of the book when it comes out. And I'm planning on, as of now, calling that second volume of the book "Does God Heal Amputees?" And talk about that. That's not the only case, but it is one of the more interesting ones. Yeah, no, that's true.
Atheist scientists, really? I was not aware of that.
On some occasions they do. Yeah, I don't know how, I don't want to get off topic on that, but one of the, I will just, on that point, this isn't explicitly with Marian Apparitions, but with Catholic miracles in general. One of the top scholars on the topic is Jacqueline Duffin, who is a medical historian and hematologist. And I think she still is an atheist actually, but she publishes this in Oxford University Press on Catholic miracles, and she admits that some of them are medically inexplicable. And the reason that she got into it in the first place was because back in the 1970s, when she was starting off as a medical operator, a hematologist, she was brought a slide of cells and was asked to look into it. And she saw that this was a case of leukemia, a very aggressive case of leukemia that had gone to remission and then relapsed, which at that point is a death sentence, because by that period in time, once cancer relapses after treatment, it's basically spread and it's not treatable at that point. But she was amazed to see that the slide showed that it went away again. And that was very unusual. And so she asks the person who gave this to her jokingly, well, was this a lawsuit or a miracle? She assumed the patient had died and this was some like medical malpractice. And they said, quite seriously, oh no, this is a miracle. She's like, what do you mean? They said, well, actually the Catholic Church is currently looking into the canonization of Marguerite Duval, Canada's first saint. And this is one of the miracles in consideration. This woman had actually prayed. She had gotten cancer relapse. She had prayed to Margaret to heal her. And a few days later, her cancer completely went to remission inexplicably. And they wanted to get a third party's opinion. And so now that you know that, do you want to come to Rome and to testify on behalf of this miracle? And Duffin's like, well, I'm an atheist. I don't think that. And they're like, that's fine. We just want your medical opinion. You don't have to give, that. So she reluctantly goes there, testifies before this, and gives her medical opinion that as of now, there's no explanation as to how this happened, even though she personally doesn't want to give any theological ascription. And the church took that and eventually canonized Margaret. And that inspired her to want to look into this. So she got some of the Vatican records and looked into 1,500 cases of these from the 1500s to the present and published on those. So that's sort of the background of the atheist scientist aspect. But it is really
incredible.
Fascinating.
Yeah, she still remains an atheist. Oh man.
Yeah, and she said she remains an atheist because she says, like, I don't know what causes it, and I don't necessarily think it's God, but she's like, that's my own personal faith. Like, I think it's some unknown natural explanation, but I admit that I'm in the same camp as someone who believes that it's God, and like, we can't, that's their faith. So she's not a dogmatic atheist, but she definitely thinks that she says she believes in miracles, and since that she believes there's definitely stuff that we can't explain that she thinks is fascinating. So
wonderful. That's incredible. That truly is incredible. And I do want to say one thing on the air. And I don't think my friend Dr. Loftus will mind me saying it. I'm pretty sure you're well aware of the renowned atheist, John Loftus. I'm pretty sure you've probably heard of him.
Yeah, I was Jimmy Aiken and I debated him and Darren Slade on Cameron's show.
Did you really?
Yeah, this was this.
Okay.
This would have been December, I think, of 2023.
I got to look at that. Yeah. I got to watch it today.
Yeah.
Now, that's awesome. Now, John and myself are good friends. We've debated many times. I debated him shortly before COVID in Dallas, Texas. And I want to tell the audience one thing that John told me on our way back to the hotel room. We're walking back to the hotel room. We had debated the resurrection. And then on the way back to the hotel room, he tells me, one topic that I won't ever debate you on, he says, because I don't know how to explain it away and I don't want to touch it with a 100-foot pole, are miracles. I don't know how to touch upon Eucharistic miracles or apparitions. They confused me. So, wow, that was
it's interesting because he wrote a book against miracles a few years after that. Yeah,
sure
so maybe that was meant to calm him down.
It could have been. It could have been. Not, no offense, John, but not a very good book, John. Not a very good book.
There are some good essays in it. I don't think the book itself is that good.
Nah.
There also very little touching on actual. I think the only ones that address the cases are Edward Babinski's chapter and Darren Slade's chapter. They both criticize Craig Keener's work on miracles. But other than that, there's really, most of it deals with the resurrection or epistemology and like prophecies, sort of not really with the modern stuff. And there's not really as much material on critiquing that, unfortunately.
Yeah. That's an area where I don't think atheists can do very well against.
I would agree in that opinion, but I also think people haven't really pushed it forward enough as an apologetic. So maybe that's why there's a lack of responses, but maybe we'll see more. So
now, because thanks to Alex O'Connor, maybe now it'll be get pushed forward more.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think so. The brother Sam has put it forth, and then after Sam, our mutual friend Cameron Bertuzzi as well. So hey, I think that if it can be crafted in an apologetic manner, I'd love to see how it can be utilized. Would love to see.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, if you want to go into some of the other cases,
whatever direction you want, brother. My platform is yours. Whatever direction, my friend.
I appreciate that. Well, let me go ahead. Can I share the screen? Do you mind?
Yes, definitely. Let me know. I'll look in the bottom.
Okay. Let me do that. All right. Can you see that?
Yep. There you go.
Right. Perfect. I'm just going to expand this real fast. So
you got
it. Okay. There we go. All right. Got it. So a couple of these you have on here, as I said, Lourdes, or Lourdes, if you're not that. One of the more interesting ones. So this happened in 1858. A young French girl named Bernadette Soubirous, I believe she was 14 at the time, kept claiming to see this lady. She called her a beautiful woman, clothed in white and blue, and no one else could see her. But she would go to this grotto and talk to this woman. I believe it was a total of 18 times, or maybe it was 28, I forget. but a lot of the time, and she'd never recognized her, but she would go and pray, and the woman would ask her to perform penance and to pray, and she would be in this very much vision-like state. And the woman eventually identified herself by saying, "Je suis Immaculée Conception," or "I am the Immaculate Conception," the third from the last appearance. And so that is what identified this as the Virgin Mary to her. Now, no one else, as far as I know, actually claimed to be able to see this apparition other than Bernadette. So maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was hallucinating. She is, after all, a young girl. But there were interesting things that happened. There is one eyewitness account where when she was having these experiences, she would be very much in a religious ecstasy, in a daze, where she would be staring straight ahead, not blinking, and very much fixated and almost in another state of mind. Right. And while she was doing this, you could basically do anything. She would notice it. One time she was holding a candle in reverence while she was doing this. And one doctor at the time noted that her hand was actually like on the fire of the candle in her clothes, and it wasn't burning, didn't flinch at all as she was in this dazed state. Now, when she got out of this state and was walking back, he took a little bit of it and burned her side without her looking, and she jumped back and was in pain, like when she wasn't that. But when she was in the religious state, no reaction to it at all. Another case, she apparently became transfigured, similar to how Jesus was transfigured on a mountain. There were eyewitnesses who said that she lit up like the sun and there, even though they didn't see Mary, but while she was having one of these ecstasies. So whether or not those are legitimate or tricks of the eye or the sun reflecting off of it, who knows? But there are contemporary accounts of this. So when people talk about how, the miracles of Jesus must be later legends because of all the fantastic things to report, whether or not you actually believe they're legitimate, there are plenty of eyewitness reports of people allegedly becoming transfigured, allegedly doing all these weird things. Wow. And so we don't need to say that these are, we don't have to say they're later legends. You can say that these are eyewitness accounts and maybe there's another explanation, but it doesn't mean that no one ever would have claimed to see this firsthand. This has to be written down much later in that sense. So I think that this example is a good case study in terms of how this works. But more interesting than the actual apparition was what happened after this. So Our Lady tells Bernadette to basically crawl at the ground and that she'll find a spring of water. So she does, and there's a water spring that pops up and it turns into this grotto of water. And pilgrims would come and then literally drink the water because they thought the Virgin Mary showed them that's where it was, and this was sort of blessed water. And as this happened in the 1850s, people claimed that they were allegedly healed. Now, obviously, not every single claim is going to be legitimate, but after a while, they started to accumulate. And so a doctor was appointed to look into these. So I think it was in 1862 is when the first couple reports were made where the doctor conducted an investigation. The very first example of a miracle in Lourdes was a woman who had a paralyzed hand for many years who suddenly was able to regain it again after she dipped it in the water. And then you have an infant who was healed. So these start to build up, and as these go on, they get more sophisticated. So now you have, in the early 1900s, the Medical Bureau of Lourdes forms, where the Catholic Church authorizes to say, hey, if you all want to look into these, use the Lambertini criteria that we use when we're looking at saints. You have our blessing to look into this and to use science to investigate these. So that is what the church has been doing for the past 150 years with Lourdes. So the process, generally speaking, has changed since the 1950s. But the way that it goes normally now is that you have an individual who goes to Lourdes on a pilgrimage, and there's usually a pilgrimage doctor that accompanies them because these are people who are usually very sick with chronic illnesses. So they need accompaniment in that way. And they come to Lourdes with a medical history. They have a docket, basically, that's a summary of what their disease is, what their treatments are, et cetera, et cetera. If someone claims to be healed at Lourdes, this is then filed and reported to the medical bureau and the president there, who then looks into this, examines the patient. Do they really look like they've been healed? If nothing's there and it's nothing big deal, it gets dismissed. If there's enough where it's worth looking into, they open up a case file. Then a year later, the person has to come back to Lourdes and be examined again by the doctor. In between this year, before they come back in again, the medical the medical bureau's president contacts the primary physicians of the patient and gets all of their medical records. It says, okay, I want to see this, interview them, get to know all of what was their medical history, what medicine were they on, what do they have? Then all of these medical records are looked at. The patient is brought back the next year. And then every doctor who is at Lourdes at any given time who registers, again, these are doctors who travel with the patients, is allowed to look into this. So they'll call all the doctors here to say, here is this patient. A year ago, they claimed to have been healed of this.
Yep.
Here is the summary of their medical history. Here's what their doctors say. How are we feeling? And this is various specialists, all that. And then they will vote. And then this process usually repeats 2, 3, 4, 5 times over the course of several years. So if they vote to continue, great, they'll do it again. If they vote that it's not worth looking into, they close the file at that point. Since the 1950s, there's been an extra step. Once several votes have been gone through repeatedly, usually about 3 times, with different instances of doctors, of panels of doctors, and then gets sent to the international panel, which is comprised of about 30 doctors of different specializations. Then they have to look at the records and look at it and debate and send in specialists to look at this to try to see if there's a national explanation to it. If the majority of those doctors don't have an explanation as well and declare it medically inexplicable, then it goes to the church. Then it goes specifically to the bishop of the diocese in which the patient resided in. So then the bishop has to get a panel of people. They're allowed to get other doctors if they want to look into this, to make sure the theology is there, to make sure that the person is not like an attention seeker, that they seem honest. The patient has to go through many, many physical reviews, constantly undergoing medical tests to make sure they're still healed. They also have to undergo a psychological evaluation to make sure they're not prone to hallucinations or to lying or anything else. So after all of this process, the bishop can then decide to declare this as an official miracle or not. And if it is, great. If it's not, there are cases where the medical bureau signs off on it and the bishop still doesn't want to say it's a miracle just for their own apprehension. But out of all of that, this has officially happened 71 times in the course of 1858 to today.
Talk about meticulous. Wow.
I know, right?
Wow.
So if you want the actual numbers, I have this in the book, but this is what it looks like. So you can see the majority of cases were from 1891 to 1920, and they have gradually started to drop off. And some people would say, well, look, this is evidence that medicine's gotten better. Misdiagnoses are a thing, and that's why this is happening, right? But if you also look at the average correlation between the cures and how long it takes them to recognize it, it's gotten a lot longer. They've gotten more meticulous. Ever since the 1950s, when the International Bureau was established, the average wait time currently for between when the person is cured and when they declare a miracle is 30 years. So that's 30 years of you having to go. And a lot of people actually drop out. They start the process and say, sure, I'll do it. And then they just say, I can't do this anymore. I have to travel to Lourdes every year to undergo another doctor's visit. I'm just exhausted. I'm just satisfied with taking it on faith that I'm healed. I know the Mary healed me. I don't need it to be verified in this sense. And a lot of them drop out because it takes so long. But the reason why there's less miracles now is partially because of how long it's taken, and they've doubled down on that. So that's one reason. But it's really fascinating when you think of 71. Again, out of the thousands of people that go there every year, that's not statistically significant. But even one miracle is all you technically need to do this, right? These are genuinely inexplicable. So what kind of things are we looking at here? So this is just a list of the things that I had photos of, right, of some of the more interesting ones. So I won't go into all of these in detail just to save you time, but the one on the left is the tibia of Pierre Derrida. I actually did a whole article on this on Academia if you're curious, but
you've got an Academia page.
I do.
Okay. Before we're done, you got to plug everything you got before we're done. Everything you got.
Absolutely. I will do that. You can put in the description. Yeah. So I have a whole Academia page on this particular one on the left. So I will read that if you want all the details. But the short version is that there was a laborer in Belgium who broke his leg after a tree fell on it, and he was disabled for 7 or 8 years. And the leg was so bad that you could bend it and literally see the bone sticking out. It was an open sore that they couldn't treat. They wanted to amputate it, but he refused. And he goes to a shrine. It was actually a copy of the Lourdes shrine in Belgium. And he prays. He just says, Our Lady, I just want to be able to help provide for my family again. I don't have a job anymore. I don't have a pension anymore. Please help me. And as he prays for this, the bandages fall off, the pus goes away, and his leg is completely back to normal. And there are witnesses who signed affidavits to say that they saw the leg before and after it was cured. So there were objections to this. The skeptics blew up on this, and it was a long debate. It's very interesting history. There's actually a wager that was put, but no one won. It's a long story. I go over all of that in the article if you were curious to read it. But but what you're seeing is the actual bones that they exhumed after he died. They buried up they exhumed his skeleton and have that, the bones. So you can see on the left side there, the little bit of its malformation. That's where the bone is healed again. So you can tell it's a malunion. So you can tell it really was broken at one point and healed again. The second one is from Marie Borel. She was a woman who had appendicitis. This was in the early 20th century when they obviously weren't able to treat it as well. So they had made incisions into her to treat this, and they removed the appendix, and all was going well, but the incision opened up again. And they tried closing it, and it opened up again. And she basically ended up getting a kind of tuberculosis, but she kept getting worse and worse, where multiple incisions kept opening up, and it gets really gross, but there's pus and bile. And at one point it pierced her intestines. The one on her back was really deep, about as thick as your thumb. And it pierced her intestines so much to where fecal matter was basically pouring outside of her because it was like that deep, and so you couldn't really get anything through her stomach or intestines that are all pouring out. It's gross. But she had dealt with this, I think, for 6 or 7 years, continually getting worse. Doctors could not treat this. They kept trying to surgically close it. Every time it would open up. And so she was dying, but she's taken to Lourdes on a stretcher. She goes in the water and prays. And when she comes out, she takes off the bandages and her flesh is completely dried. And the holes this picture was taken right after she was healed. You can see where the holes are, but they're closed now. There's skin on top of them. And so, this condition she'd been dealing with for years that had only gotten worse, suddenly all closed within a few minutes of her going to Lourdes and on this pilgrimage. And she remained healed for the rest of her life. So this was published in the British Medical Journal at the time, and all of this fascinating stuff. You can literally see photos of that. So that's fascinating. The one on the right is from a child named Francis Pascal in the late 1930s, who suffered. At first, he had problems with his vision. He was 4 years old at the time. He started to lose balance, and very quickly he went completely blind. I don't just mean visually impaired, but couldn't tell the difference between night and day when they did optical exams. And that's what that paper is. It's his vision report, complete blindness. And he also lost all movement in his limbs, arms and legs. And he was diagnosed with tubercular meningitis, which is basically when your brain swells up and it causes severe nerve damage. And this is usually very quickly fatal. Nowadays it's treatable, but in the 1930s it was almost especially in kids. So they go to Lourdes, and after his mom dips him in the water a few times, he comes out, and as she's walking back, he points, is like, "Mama, look, I can see a red," I think it was like a bicycle or something. And so he could see. So she puts him down, and he starts to walk, and he's a little hesitant at first. He hasn't walked in a few months, but he's able to move again. So his mom takes him back, and he's able to have his eyesight has gotten better. He's able to move again. He can move his arms and legs despite not before. And his doctor has no medical explanation for how he suddenly got better despite only getting worse and was expected to die at that point. So that's another interesting one. Again, I won't go through all of these extensively, but you get the picture in terms of how we're doing this.
I'm blown away.
The one on the left. Yeah, absolutely. The one on the left is Vittorio Micheli. He was a soldier with hip cancer that was eating away at his pelvis after he goes to Lourdes. Not only is the cancer gone, but the bone is restored. You can see that on the pre and post x-rays. The middle one is Sergei Francois, who had a hematoma on his, I believe it was his lower back that prevented him from walking. He had to walk with a cane and had a severe limp on his left leg for years, was on plenty of pain medications. After he goes to Lourdes, he's able to completely walk again. And he goes on a long, I think, 50-mile hike or something after, the day after that or something, pilgrimage to celebrate. And the one on the right's actually one of the most recent ones that actually happened. This is the 70th miracle. Her name was Bernadette Mouriot. Ironically, she was named after the Bernadette the girl who saw the Lourdes apparition. So it's kind of funny. But Bernadette Mouriot was a nun in France who way back in the 60s started to suffer from back pain. And this progressively got worse to where she became incontinent. She had to have a catheter. She couldn't use her legs much. She had to have an electric pump in her spine to just be able to move her leg, was mostly wheelchair bound, and was on so many daily morphine to where she was basically dependent on it. And she'd been diagnosed with a disease called cata equina, which affects the lower back and spine and is extraordinarily painful and is irreversible if you don't treat it immediately. So she suffered for this for 40 years, progressively getting worse. And by the time she went to Lourdes, she was in a wheelchair on this. But after she goes back from Lourdes 3 days later, she's praying the rosary and she hears a voice internally that tells her to take the boot off. And so she does, and she's able to walk again without any pain. And not only was she able to completely walk again, take her catheter out with no issue, but she also was able to just quit the morphine like that, which is also unusual because people usually develop a dependency on it. So you have all this happen at the same time. And this was reviewed again by the president of Lourdes Medical Bureau in an interview with 2020 about 2 years ago when he was asked about this case, and that's her x-ray of her spine. Wow. He said that he can say with absolute certainty that she was reviewed by at least 300 doctors through this whole process, and that anyone who's curious can go to Lourdes and see the medical file on her. So she's still alive to this day. That was in 2008. They waited 10 years before they declared it a miracle, and she is still in perfectly good health. So it's pretty incredible to see people who've had years of disease that's only gotten worse suddenly like that just get better all of a sudden. Now, some of that could be psychological. It is true. Sure. Effect does play that, but the placebo effect can only go so far. You don't have something that quickly to that extreme. Usually the placebo effect happens and then it wears off and then you get sick again. It doesn't have that long of an effect, right? So the fact that these people are they don't just feel better, but they're able to quit their medications and treatments without any issues is pretty remarkable, and not something you find really in secular literature to that extent.
No, not at all. That's pretty mind-blowing, I have to say. And you bring up a very good point there with the placebo effect. Really only so far that can go to really everything points to this being of the miraculous nature. That truly is amazing. The photographs are incredible. Yeah. The amount of documentation. Caleb, I got to say, the amount of research you've done is second to none. This is tremendous, my friend.
I appreciate it. And that's what I really wanted to do, because there is material on miracles, but it's very hard to find anything that gets into the medical. There's a couple, but it's hard to get. I wanted to get a book that really dealt with the medical documentation. And sometimes it is a little bit boring because I had to go into the details. And like, I think I say at one point in the book, like, I know it's meticulous, but I have to be meticulous because the details matter in this case.
They do.
So lots of footnotes where it's just me citing this particular report on this date or something that gets a little technical, and me having to look up the literature on this disease. Does this disease normally go away? And if so, how fast does it normally go away, and all that stuff. So that's why it's taken me 4 or 5 years to write just this volume. So it's been a lot, but yeah, I wanted to be able to get a book that combines all of the best cases I could find under one cover, and provide, when I could, photos of documentation and all that stuff. Yeah. Because it's hard to find the books out that they're not just anecdotal that deal with medical evidence. So
were they hard to track down? Was it pretty hard to track the stuff down?
It depends. So a lot of the stuff on Lourdes, when you get into the primary literature, a lot of it is not in English. There's a lot that is, but I wanted, you always want to find the primary sources. So when you look at books by people like Boissari, who's one of the presidents in 1900 who wrote a book on it, that's written in French, so having to translate that, some of these are from documentaries that are in French or Spanish. Some of these are from the one that was actually on the left there with the pelvis was published in, I believe it was by the Canadian Journal of Medicine back in the 60s on that case. So some of these are published in medical journals as well, widely enough. So it is pretty interesting. So you kind of get them from different places. Marian tear up. Oh, that's so sweet, Scholar. Thank you.
That's awesome.
Oh, those super chats. Absolutely. I'll do one more from Lourdes and we can move on from that. I think they're all great stories. So this is one of the more recent cases. This is Daniela Castelli. So in 1980, she started having chest palpitations and chest pain. So she goes to get this seen, and they give her some medications to mitigate this, but that does not work. So 1982, they do an ultrasound. They see that there are these masses, not cancerous, but they are tumors. They are growths within her heart. And so she undergoes many surgeries to remove these, but this is not successful. So she only grows more and more sick. I believe she undergoes something like 7 to 10 different major surgeries on her heart over the next several years. No improvement, only gets more sick, to the point where she is basically almost in hospice care. And at this point, the tumor spread to her rectum, to her anus, to her vagina, to her lower abdomen, other areas. And so this is considered to be fatal. In 1989, in the spring, her blood pressure was 280 over 150, which is considered to be highly critical and is indicative of a heart attack. I believe that normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. So that's very, very much dangerous to where it could be lethal. So take in mind, this woman for the past 9 years has had a progressively worsening heart condition with every medication she's taken has not worked. Every surgery she has not worked. It's only gotten progressively worse. And she's now at a near fatal spot. She goes to Lourdes as a last result. When she gets in the water, she instantly feels better and at peace. And all of her chest pain stops. She throws out all of her medications and is remarkably better off since in that sense. So the doctors reviewed this and unanimously declared that this was medically inexplicable after all she had gone through. Out of curiosity, if you want to take a guess, the healing was in 1989. Do you want to guess what year they declared this as a miracle?
5 years ago?
A little bit more than that, but close. 2013, which would mean
Okay.
this was 31 years. Yeah, if you want to do the thing there. So that was.
I wasn't too far off.
Yeah, no, it was, yeah. So this is one of the most recent ones. This is miracle number 69. But that's so when you think about the event took place in 1989, she was reviewed. Her medical records were reviewed for 30 years before they said, all right, we'll sign off on this as a miracle, just to make sure that there was that it didn't relapse, that she didn't go back and get sick again, to make sure that there wasn't some explanation. So it's pretty incredible how long they take to wait to verify these things, right? So,
and it also, in my opinion, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it really does put the mind at ease, because the amount of meticulous research being done is tremendous. It really is. It seems like the research and the study and everything is making sure that there are no holes that people can poke through, and that it truly is a verifiable miracle. Because look, a lot of this is very serious. These are very serious claims, and they're incredible. And well, we believe that our Lord and Savior can do anything, of course. Miracles, we believe in them. But then, of course, to explain things like this is virtually impossible outside of recognizing it to be a miracle. But that is quite some time. To me, it really is evidence of them being very meticulous.
Absolutely. And again, I'm not going to say that every Lourdes miracle is accurate, because especially if you look in the early 1800s, a lot of those are not as best, it makes sense. They weren't as meticulous, so they didn't have as much medical documentation at that time. So you do have to deal with a lot more eyeballing and guessing. So, but there are also other ones that are incredible that didn't get, that the church, that the medical bureau signed off on, but the church just never approved. So you kind of get a little bit back and forth there. But even if you don't think that all 71 are miracles, even if a handful of those are.
Is there a reason why? Do you know? Is there a reason why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, no one really knows the reason. It's a combination of which papal administrations in there. Some papal administrations like doing it, some of them don't. Sometimes during World War II, they put a freeze on it because France was being invaded by Germany. So they kind of had other concerns at the moment, No there's reasons for that. Sometimes it's also because as modern medicine gets better, one of the criteria you have to have for it to be called a miracle is that it was a spontaneous healing, which means that you can't say that the person had any medicine that could have caused it, right? Okay. Well, as medicine gets better, it's a lot more common now. Back in the late 1800s, if you got like tuberculosis, they didn't have treatments for it. You were gone for. So for that to just go away is incredible. Nowadays, a lot of almost everyone, especially in Europe where they have universal health care, everyone has access to some medical care. So it's hard to find a case of people who didn't have any medicine, or at least had medicine that was clearly not helping them, which was in this case, to be able to do it. So that's why they're a lot more hesitant to sign off on it nowadays. But it is a strange thing for sure. And we don't always know why. So it is remarkable, I think, regardless. And so even if, and there are some Protestants I know who will say, well, yeah, sure, these could be miracles. God's having mercy on people being healed, but we don't have to say it's the Virgin Mary. And that might be true, but certainly the person being healed thinks it's the Virgin Mary. So it is kind of weird to think of God being, I don't want to say deceptive, but it is implied to that, to say that this person certainly believes in this. And why is this mostly happening at Lourdes, right? Why is this not, we don't really have an equivalent of like a Protestant shrine where people are going to be healed. I mean, there's some charismatic circles, but the Protestants are generally not as meticulous, unfortunately, as the Catholics are. I think that there are some really good Protestant miracles out there, especially their healings, but a lot of that's recent and it's kind of underdeveloped. So the Catholics definitely have it when it comes to meticulousness.
Now, this is something that I have no idea about. When it comes to the level of, and I know we'll get to Zeitoun in a moment, the level of evidence and witnesses and what have you, for these apparitions, for these miracles, let's talk about apparitions for the time being. Is there anything parallel within Protestantism of an apparition or anything of the sort?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the closest thing you'd probably find in Protestantism would be Christophanies, visions of Jesus appearing to people, which you do have in Catholicism as well.
Sure.
But there's charismatic circles. I know people, I don't think they'd want me to, I won't name them, but I do have friends who I really respect who have claimed to have had a Christophany. Not like a full on, nothing like the resurrection where, they're touching it like that, but a vision. And this person is not someone who is overly charismatic. They're very much analytical, very much like research, they're not someone who I would just think would just be prone to easily be gullible or hallucinate something.
Sure.
And I know them well enough where I don't think that they would lie to me. I think they're being genuinely sincere. So I have to look at that and say, well, is that, I believe they're telling me the truth. Were they seeing something that was internal? Was it a hypnopompic hallucination? Sometimes happens. You never know. And so I try to be as careful as I can. And I never am going to tell someone, no, you didn't see Jesus, because I can't prove that. But I will usually reserve judgment unless I think there's enough there to say that it wasn't just a projection of your mind. So you have to just look at it on a case-by-case basis. But there are some examples in Protestantism where people are healed by a vision of Jesus in that way. There was one particular case. I won't go into all the details. You can tell I think collectively between all of them, probably at least 70 different ones cases I can think of, stuff that are like well documented.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go over all of them, obviously, but I do know of one that
you've done your work.
I try. I do know of one that happened in the mid 20th century, 1940s, of a girl who was born with a very severe form of congenital scoliosis, to where her spine was twisted, and it got so bad when she hit puberty that she basically was stuck with her head in her lap the whole time and couldn't really stand up. But she'd had a vision of Jesus appear to her, and I think she was Baptist or something, wasn't Catholic, and Jesus told her that he was going to heal her on, like, it was August 3rd, 1941 at 3:00 exactly. So her family gets ready for this, and so they're sitting there, and at 3:00, we have signed affidavits of witnesses who hear her back pop into place again, and her standing up, and then she lifts the chair up and is running around, happy and crying in this way. And she says, I can see Jesus, and he's in front of me. And, she was healed from that. So, and she's been healed ever since. I think she died in the 70s, but she was perfectly normal ever since then. So, I take that very seriously, and
no doubt.
I don't think it wasn't as meticulously investigated as something in this case, but
you
still have a very visibly obvious disease that someone claimed was healed because they had a vision, an apparition of Jesus in this case, in a Protestant context. So I'm open to that having actually been Jesus, in that way. And some of my cessationist friends probably won't like me saying that, but I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah. Right. That is amazing. That truly is amazing.
Yeah. And I think if any one of us saw something like that, we would probably be taken aback as well,
There's no doubt.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So another one of these, this one's not as well known of a case, but this is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Our Lady of Buron. I
have not. No, I haven't.
This was in Belgium in the 1930s. So this was a group of kids pictured there who claimed to see the Virgin Mary dressed in gold with a hat, one of many. And so this was the apparition itself wasn't overly, I say, different, because you have a lot of cases where kids claim to see. In fact, almost all of these cases, besides Zeitoun, it's almost always young kids who see the Virgin Mary. It's interesting. Theologically, I don't know why that is, if she has a preference for children, or if you're a skeptic, you could say because kids have wild imaginations, right? So
right.
What the explanation is not always certain, but these kids see this visionary of the Virgin Mary. But as these kids are seeing this, there's another woman named Marie van Mille, and from the age of 17 years old, she had suffered from it was tuberculosis osteomyelitis is what it was eventually diagnosed as, which is a tuberculosis of the bone that causes it to swell and it spreads. It's really terrible. And back in the early 1900s, tuberculosis was, a major disease that was almost certainly fatal. But she'd had this for, I think it was since 1919, so almost 20 years, like about 17 years. And at first it caused her to have pus and these swellings, and bone would come out of it. And then when that resolved, she would get tumors on her neck, and her right leg would swell so much that it was twice as big as her other one. And so she was eventually in the hospital, and they were going to do surgery, but they couldn't do it because it was too risky. So she was basically left for dead. And again, she'd been getting this progressively worsening disease for over a decade at this point. So they take her to these girls who claim that the Virgin Mary's appeared in this apparition, and she just asked for them to have mercy and pray for them, which they do. They lay hands on her and pray for her.
Yeah.
And as they take this woman back home on an ambulance, as she's sleeping in the ambulance, she wakes up. This is a few hours later, and her leg is completely back to normal. The tumors on her neck are gone. And she gets up and is able to walk. And when the doctors looked at her, there was no sign of the tuberculosis anywhere on the scans. And so they had the bishop called for a local commission of doctors, and they looked into this and they waited 15 years before they made a declaration to follow up on her to make sure she was still in good health. And they declared that there was no medical explanation for this. So again, you have a disease here that's progressively gotten worse for decades. Suddenly she's prayed for by these visionaries who claim the Virgin Mary appears to them. A few hours later, all visible signs go away. She feels better. She's able to walk. Over 15 years later, no relapse, doesn't come back. I think it's hard to explain by the placebo effect. It's
very hard to explain. Extremely hard
to write it off, So, yeah, absolutely.
That's tremendous. And this is one I'd never heard of. This is very rarely spoken of, I imagine.
Of course, yeah. Everyone, I mean, not everyone. A lot of people have heard of Fatima and the others. So I wanted to include in here a couple more, like Our Lady of the Pillar or Our Lady of Beyond, because they're not as well known, but they're no less interesting when you look at some of the cases affiliated. Another one is Medjugorje, which is one of the most controversial ones because the church still hasn't affirmed these. And basically, these young kids in Czechoslovakia, modern day, or I think it was Yugoslavia at the time, modern day. I want to say it's Croatia, in terms of where it was, communist country at the time, appeared to these children, and they claimed to see this. But there was a lot of controversy in terms of how they saw it and if they were faking it. And there was some indication that when they got older, they were using this to sort of profit off of it, like they were paying for interviews and stuff like that. So there was some skepticism in terms of how much this was legitimate. And I think the church has been very resilient to it. But Medjugorje is still one of the most well-known modern-day Marian apparitions, I think because it's more recent. And lots of people still pilgrim to it. But the actual case I want to talk about that's a healing case that's associated with this that I think is more interesting, or at least better evidenced, let's say, than Medjugorje, is the healing of Rita Klaus from multiple sclerosis. So Rita had developed symptoms back in 1960 when she was a nun. Wow. When she was in the shower, her vision started to black out and she lost balance and had trouble gripping things. And eventually it got so bad, like with trembling hands, that she had to renounce her vows. So she couldn't do it anymore because of that. So she goes and moves to Philadelphia. And at this point, her conditions start to go into remission. She does feel a little bit better because multiple sclerosis has different levels of severity. So it gets a little bit better. She has to wear orthopedic shoes. And so she gets married and she doesn't tell her husband her diagnosis. She tells him that she had polio as a kid and that's why she has the orthopedic shoes. But she didn't tell him that she was diagnosed with MS because MS is not a curable disease. Nowadays there's medicine to mitigate it and make the symptoms less severe, but it can't be like actually cured. So she does this, and as they have their some of their kids and stuff, one day she's holding her child and suddenly her arm gives out and she drops the baby. Now the baby was fine, but she started to lose balance. And a few days after that, when they're going to the store, she becomes paralyzed from the neck down and literally can't move and loses control of her bowels and becomes incontinent. And they take her to the doctor, and when they're doing a lumbar puncture, he comes back and it's like, I think you have MS. And that's when she admits, like, yes, I was diagnosed with that about 15 years ago. And I didn't tell anyone. Again, when it went away, I thought it had been there, but I didn't want my husband I didn't think he'd ever marry me and love me if he knew I had this incurable disease, right? So eventually he forgave her for that and said that we're going to just deal with this together. So it's a really touching story. That was in 78 is when she started to have this relapse. And then her condition only got worse, as is typical with MS. As you get older, it gets worse. So she, at first she had to use orthopedic shoes. Then that turned into a cane. Then the cane turned into arm crutches, and the arm crutches turned to a wheelchair. Had to be on a catheter. Very little use of her legs. It would usually take her 20 minutes just to get up a flight of stairs with people carrying her in that way. So really miserable, sad state. And so she one day was praying, she was reading a book someone had given her on the Medjugorje visionaries about these little girls. And this at the time was still going on in 86. So she was really interested in that. So I believe that she believed in it. So she put her book down and just prayed to Our Lady of Medjugorje to say, if you're real and you did this, I believe in you and I want you to please, heal me if you can. So nothing immediately happened. She wakes up the next day and goes to her seminary, which she was studying at the time. And it's funny because the day she goes to that class, her professor, who was more of a cessationist, was talking about how God doesn't do miracles anymore. And as she's sitting there, she's able to wiggle her toe for the first time. She's like, that's unusual. I've never been able to do that before. And starts to heat, right, in her legs, which she hadn't felt nerves in years. So when she gets home, she gets enough feeling in her legs where she is able to get up. And usually she would have to use arm canes if she was getting off her wheelchair, but she gets up without the arm canes and takes off her cast and runs up the stairs and becomes ecstatic. And that's when she's jumping up and down. It's like, oh my gosh. So she calls her husband to get there, her neighbor. She comes and jumps and hugs her husband. And her husband didn't even recognize her for a second. Like, who is this woman who is running up to me? That can't be my wife. So she does this and is excited. And you can see that she used to be in a wheelchair in that picture, but her doctors verified this. So yeah, that was on June 18th, 1986. And another thing that I didn't mention that's really interesting is that back when she had the disease, it was especially bad in her right leg, to where it put so much pressure on one of her sciatic nerves that it caused immeasurable pain. So she had to have what's called a retinal release, which is where they go and cut the tendons of your leg and where your knees are. And that's so that there's not pressure on the bone pushing down on it anymore. Now, that also means that you wouldn't be able to walk, but at this point she already couldn't walk. So they said, we might as well. So she did that. So this had twisted her right leg, right, in that way. When she was healed, not only did her MS go away, but her leg was also corrected again, right, which had been surgically done. So the tendons had grown back, basically. And that is also very hard to explain for that happening at the same time. So this is just, I won't read this verbatim, but this is actually a quote from one of her therapists at a Harmville Rehabilitation Center, who talk about how they had examined her when she'd come in and she hadn't had any improvements. And then in June, she comes back a few days after she was healed, suddenly able to walk again, and they weren't able to explain it. And this was when they were interviewed by local newspapers, and it's still available if anyone's curious. Just look up Rita Klaus on Google Newspaper Archives, and you'll see a paper from the Pittsburgh Press publishing on this, discussing this secular source. So really interesting case of someone praying to the visionaries, not the visionaries, to the Our Lady, the apparition of Medjugorje, and being healed. So whether or not you think Medjugorje is legitimate, and I have my doubts, it is interesting to see someone healed on behalf of that in that way. So
is it one of the ones that you have your reservations about? Then do you think that there is anything that would change, or your reservations are pretty deep there?
I mean, I think that they're fairly deep. I'd have to look into it more, but from what I've seen, I've been unimpressed. And it's a very difficult question to ask. How much do these subsequent healing miracles, how much do those vindicate the actual visionaries? Because you could say, are these just God having mercy on people, or is this God doing this so that he can say, hey guys, you should believe the Medjugorje visionaries, they're telling the truth? It's hard to know. And maybe
that's tough.
Could say it is.
That's a great question you posed. That's a great one. That's tough when you put it like that. Because we know the Lord that truly does show mercy. That's a tough one to really crack. Now I know, man, I remember the last time I did a show talking about Medjugorje, there are a lot of people very passionate about Medjugorje, and then there are people that just really are passionately against it. That are they mean very well. They've done their meticulous research. Now I'm ignorant, and I have not done the deep research. You who have done the top research, you do have your reservations. Have you ever, I'm curious, have you ever spoken to a passionate advocate for Medjugorje? That you have, I imagine.
No, I think I have to people who defend Fatima. I don't think I've talked to passionate ones about them. I don't think I've ran into many Medjugorje defenders. I know that they're out there, but it's, I guess, just within my wheelhouse. It's hard to find, a lot of people who look into this as much as maybe I do. So, I haven't, but I have seen people online talking about it. I've not dialogued with them. So I'd be really curious, but in that way. But it is a fascinating subject, I think. So we can move on to, I think, everyone's favorite.
Oh, my goodness.
Which we opened up with, right? So
I cannot wait. And I remember I told Cameron, Cameron, I can't wait. I got to check this out, man. Now, I know you're going to talk about it, but Zeitoun, until recently, as far as I know, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't getting a lot of attention in the online world, was it? Or am I wrong about that?
I mean, it had always been one of those that, if you looked up Marian Apparitions, it would be one of the main ones that popped up. But I don't think it's as well known as Fatima or the other ones. And it is surprising when you learn about the details. It is one of those where you're like, how is this not known by everyone, right? If you were to say to just a layman, did you know that there's an alleged case of a Marian apparition that was seen by about 1 million people that was photographed over the course of 3 years? People would say, what? No, they would do that. In fact, I've actually used that line when people talk about why doesn't Jesus appear in front of everyone. It's like, well, I mean, Mary might have, about 50 years ago. And people are like, what?
Yeah.
What? When? They've never even like heard of it. It's also something I also point out to whenever people try to do an argument from silence, right? When you talk about how, Matthew 27 talks about the saints rising from the dead, and Matthew's the only one who mentions it. Why don't we have everyone would have written about this, right? It's like, okay, that was 2,000 years ago in a culture where most people are illiterate and spoke the oral tradition, right? This happened, Zeitoun happened in the 1960s and 70s when most people were literate, could read, had photography, had newspapers, had national media coverage. We lived in a globalist society where people do this all there. And most people still haven't heard of it, right? And this is something that happened in the modern day with like way more evidence. So you're surprised that we don't have more records of this story from 2,000 years ago that was made in this culture. You expect more from that, but we have examples of things that have way bigger impact. We're seeing by way more people that aren't like super well known or you see, I feel like it's not a very compelling analogy because of that, because there's so many counterexamples to it.
Yes, great point. That's a very, very good point.
Yeah. So Zeitoun, what was it? So for some background, Zeitoun is traditionally in the Coptic Orthodox tradition, the area where the Virgin Mary and Joseph were believed to have stopped by when they were visiting. When they were fleeing to Egypt. Matthew talks about the slaughter of the innocents. Once Jesus dead, they flee to Egypt. Yep. And the Coptic Egyptian Christians there said, at this particular location, Zeitoun, which is a subset of Cairo, this is where the Virgin Mary, there's a particular tree where she allegedly rested. So as the story goes, in the 1920s, I believe it was, there was a businessman named Ibrahim, I forget his last name, who was going to build a hotel, but he had a dream of the Virgin Mary appearing to him and saying, don't build a hotel, build a church in my name, and then give the rest of the money to the poor. And if you do this, there'll be a miracle to reward you. So he does this. Now, this story does have some scanty documentation. This is very well talked about in Zeitoun. Okay. It is hard to find original sources for that, so I will throw that out there. But that is the context in which this does occur, allegedly. So anyway, this church is built, St. Mary's Church in Zeitoun, up in the 1920s. Fast forward about 40 years later, Egypt and Israel just ended their 6-day war. This is where Israel has become a nation. Egypt and Israel have very hot ties to each other, very much enemies. Coptic Christians are being persecuted at this point. Muslims blame these Christians for supporting Israel, supporting the Jews. They were not well liked. Egypt is a majority Muslim country, even today, but certainly back then. Yeah. So there's a lot of persecution of Coptic Christians. So that's the background of this. So on April 2nd of 1968, on top of this church, there is a Muslim man sees a woman up there who he thinks is a nun who's about to jump from the roof. And so he points to her and is like, no, don't jump, all this stuff. And so crowd starts to gather. We don't want this person to commit suicide. And as they look at it, they kind of notice and they gleam, and it looks like this figure is almost floating a little bit and is and glimmering a little bit. So people are like, what is that? Is that a woman? And someone says, it must be the Virgin Mary. It's her church. And so after a little bit, this figure disappears, right? Now that by itself would be weird, but you could say people see weird things sometimes. Maybe it was a flash of light or something. But this continued to happen over the course of the next several weeks, months, and even years. They were most intense the first couple months, where this figure would appear in the same spot on top of this church where the dome is. Sometimes it would look humanoid. Sometimes it would be a little bit more of an oblique kind of shape, depending on what you do. But eyewitnesses allegedly claimed that they could see her making movements like bowing, and they could make out clothing. You can see in that in that first picture, you could see where it kind of looks humanoid. There's a little bit of a halo going on. You could also see how it's people just sort of looking in the clouds and finding shapes. Maybe that's what's going on, right? In the second picture, this is where people allegedly claim that she's kneeling down, and it looks almost like she's bowing her head on her, like legs crossed kind of stance, right on top of this church. So you have different movements in this sense, in this way. This is probably the most well-known photo. The full one has the people at the bottom looking up at it, but you can see what looks like the Virgin Mary, right? And I've shown this picture to people who didn't know what it was coming from. I said, what does this look like? And they're like, it kind of looks like a saint, kind of looks like Mary, like traditional depictions of Mary. You can see it looks like hands are folded, a hood, and a halo. Now, this picture is enhanced. It is touched up. Some people say it could be double exposure. The original one does have a light in the shape, but it's not as clear as it is in this picture. So
Gotcha.
And I'll show you ones later. So just in the sake of transparency, a lot of the photos look more like this first one, like where it's a little bit more unclear, right? And this is also because we're talking about in the 60s being taken at night. So the photography was not perfect. So this one is touched up a little bit, but the shape is there. These are some other ones of what witnesses claimed were the Virgin Mary kneeling on top of this church surrounded by incense. That's what that cloud looks like. And some people even said they could see her holding, I guess, the Christ child in her arms, cradling it in that way. So again, you can see the differences of quality in these photos, but most of these were published in the Watani newspaper, which was a well-known newspaper at the time. And over the course of 1968 to 1971, this was seen by approximately 1 million people. There's upwards and downwards estimates, but on an average night, you'd have thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. So you get these unusual elements, right? And so you have these little doves, I say in this way, these sort of shapes that sometimes took the shape of a cross, sometimes floated there in that way. It almost looks a little bit like some UFOs.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah, in that sense, right? In that obliqueness, but some people could see it. Now, this is an example of the photos being touched up. So you see on the left here, this is the original one, and on the right where it's a lot clearer.
My goodness.
This one, yeah. So they do touch it up, certainly, but the original one's still there. And you can even see in the original the little dove, I say in air quotes, sort of like floating above it in this mysterious light. So it is fascinating to see that. So
let me ask you, if you don't mind me asking you, let's say, because I can get my iPhone and I can get a photo and I can, I guess touch up a photo, but not alter it in that sense, just merely touch it up. Are these photos altered in any way, or would you simply say they're touched up to enhance what is already there?
I don't know of any photo that's been blatantly fabricated.
Gotcha.
Where someone, I say photo, it wouldn't be Photoshop, but where someone like inserted an image on top of it that wasn't there. But they are taking photos that are more oblique of just a light and making it look a lot more detailed. There was I think his last name was, I forget his name, but it was something Jackson wrote a book. And Travis Dumsday goes over this in his recent book where he did an analysis on the photos and he basically came out sort of inconclusive. He said some of them were probably touched up, some of them were probably authentic, and we can't really know. So I don't think the photos are super, super strong evidence because there's a little bit of ambiguity in terms of how much was there, how much is double exposure. But no one denies that there was a strange light force on top of the church. There's many eyewitness testimonies to this, including from unbelievers, by the way, including from Muslims, including from journalists who were there who said, we have one named Cynthia Nelson, for example, who went there and said that she saw a light on top of the church. And if she squinted, she could see it kind of looking humanoid. She's like, yeah, I could see how you could see that, but I kind of had to make myself think of that. So some people just saw a weird light, but this light would be usually on top of the church in the dome. Sometimes it would come down in the courtyard and almost be, I say, walking, like hovering above that. Sometimes it'd be surrounded by a cloud of incense. Sometimes it would only show up for a few seconds. Sometimes it would be there for hours. It really just depends. So there was kind of inconsistency in terms of how frequently this thing showed up, but it would always be in the same relative area. Now, when we talk about what was this, right? This is a strange thing. People see weird lights sometimes. It's what the whole UFO phenomenon is. We don't always know what it is, right? So at first, when this happened, Cynthia Nelson talks about how they thought this was a reflection. The police there thought this was a reflection from the street lights onto the church. So they turned all the lights off, and it was still there. So then they thought that it was some kind of projection from like the nearby building. So they did a search of that, couldn't find anything within a 15-mile radius. They actually at one point even tore down one of the garages that was next to the church for that. And there wasn't any sign of anything there. So this thing kept appearing. I believe they turned out the entire power of Cairo at one point. They shut down the system, power grid for like a night, and it was still there. So there, as far as I know, with the investigation, after a few months, there was the Egyptian government basically say, yeah, we think this is supernatural. They couldn't find any source of where this light was coming from.
Wow.
In that way. So it was pretty thoroughly investigated in that way. And just when you look at the frequency of it, it's difficult to find it. And even most skeptics who've written about it who say, well, this is pareidolia, people seeing things based on their expectation being the Virgin Mary. Most of them still don't know where the light came from. They're like, well, it's some unknown light source with people putting Mary onto it. Like, with their imaginations or whatever. So you can have that, but the actual source of light is still unknown. And the best theory you have was published in a journal in the 80s that talked about earthquake lights, which basically when tectonic strain happens, it has electromagnetism. Sometimes it gets into the atmosphere. It's kind of controversial among geophysicists, but even if you grant that, they were saying, well, look, there were earthquakes within several hundred miles of Zeitoun, so maybe this caused it. But first of all, when you really think about that as a model, it makes virtually no sense, because they're saying that earthquakes within 400 miles. So keep that in mind of how far we're talking about here. That's like from Chicago to, I don't know what the distance, like Chicago to Cleveland, let's say, like how far we're talking about there, right? And that an earthquake in Chicago would not only cause a light in Cleveland, but that it would frequently happen at the same spot repeatedly, not within this very small courtyard of this church that it would constantly show up on. You didn't have them anywhere else, even though these earthquakes happen in all different areas. So you have to say that these earthquake lights were happening only in this particular spot repeatedly, which seems to kind of stretch credulity a little bit, I think. It's
big time. Yeah, it really does.
And there also were lots of unexplained healings with this too. Plenty of people claim to be healed. There was one woman who had, Nelson mentions that a woman had a brain tumor that went away. In fact, actually the first person who, the dove, the Jesus' baptism, that's a good point. The first person who actually saw Zeitoun, the Muslim man who pointed to her, was actually the first one healed. He had a gangrenous infection on his finger that was going to be amputated the next day. And when they took the bandages off, that was normal. So there was a council of the Cairo Medical School who investigated these, and I think they came up with about a dozen reports or so of ones that they said were medically inexplicable. So it's pretty wild when you have this. And they kind of just died out over time. And by 1971, they were happening not overly frequently, and they sort of just powdered out, and people kind of stopped caring as much as they did in 1968. And it's sort of weird as to why they stopped or why it did this, but there's really not an explanation for why that happened in that way. But they were most common when the first few months in 1968, thousands of people would see these things and would hover around it. So we don't have a good estimate of how many people exactly saw it, because how many of them came back the next night and were duplicates. But usually it's estimated to be at least in the several hundred thousands, if not a million. So it's pretty wild to think that this is, in terms of numbers, probably the most attested miracle in history. And there's still really, in my opinion, and most sociologists' opinion, no really strong explanation for it. But this is also one of the only Marian miracles where, it wasn't just witnessed by a few kids, it was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. And there wasn't a message. In almost every Marian apparition, Our Lady gives a message for people. In fact, she does that extensively. Here, the apparition doesn't even talk to anyone. She bows and gives general message and general sort of signs of peace, but there was never a declaration to anyone, which is strange of how silent she was in this sense, if this was her. So the reason for it is not clear in terms of why would Mary do this at this time. You could say that it's with the Coptic tradition. A lot of people think that's because this was after the war in Israel and Egypt, and she was unifying Muslims and Christians together to tell them to stop fighting in this way. It is interesting, though, although Muslims obviously revere Mary very seriously, she only did appear on top of the church. Never did she ever appear on top of a mosque. So I'll just throw that out there. So for whatever reason, and lots of Muslims converted to Coptic.
I was about to ask you that. There were mass conversions? And
I don't know how many. No one knows the number, but there were plenty of testimonies of people who claimed that they converted because of this. So it's pretty wild to really see that and how much people did this. And again, there was a lot of the Coptic Christians were persecuted and were not very well liked. The Egyptian government eventually did warm up to this because so many people came that it became beneficial to tourism. But initially, they were throwing rocks at people to stay away because it was so overcrowded that literally the streets they couldn't even get cars through because of how many people were blocked in this pretty small area. It just wasn't built to hold lots of crowds. So the Egyptian government did not like this at first and tried to discourage it. But as the months went on, they, I guess, sort of said, well, we can't make them go away, so we might as well embrace it to do this. So it's pretty interesting to see that. My other thing I was going to say, one of my favorite quotes was from Nelson mentions this in her article, but there was a Marxist professor who makes a comment that say, well, this occurred, I think he says in southern Egypt, where all the peasants lived and the farmers. I could believe that, but I cannot understand why so many educated people from universities and all this stuff claim this like supernatural thing. It's like we know miracles are only attested to by people who are gullible and uneducated. And so you can see his Western bias, but it was just kind of funny to see that sort of dismissal where he's like, gosh, like people who are educated and smart, like claim to see these things. Like, that's weird.
Yeah.
You know?
Wow.
Like, it's really funny to see that human influence there in that way. So there's other ones, by the way, before I forget, similar ones to this. So this is another one, and these are not as dramatic as Zeitoun. They don't go on for as long, but you have Our Lady of Ass Sweet. This is also in Egypt, similar location, also on top of a church, would appear, recreate, occasionally on top of this church for about a year. Don't know what the light source was. Again, the most recent one was in Warak. Hitting the wrong button here. Warak in 2009. Not really great photos of this, even though it's in color. People took this on like cell phones, but mysterious lights. Now, this one I think only happened for one night, so you don't have it as being meticulously investigated as Zeitoun was. But the point I'm getting at here is you have this really weird phenomenon of unknown lights showing on top of Egyptian Coptic churches in a location that's traditionally ascribed to the Virgin Mary. Kind of weird. And so, like, not only would you have to explain naturalistically like this phenomenon, but to explain why it happens mostly in Egypt on top of churches, seems to really stretch credulity, in my opinion. So it's like, yes,
and it has been approved, right? It has been approved by the Coptic Orthodox Church.
The Coptics, I don't think the Catholic Church has ever actually given a statement on it, because theologically they don't like doing it unless there's like an obvious theological message. And I think that they did look into it and didn't like have reservation. They didn't say like this is fake.
Okay.
But they just sort of, I think, were agnostic. They're like, maybe this is Mary. We're just not going to give an opinion. But the Coptics certainly did approve it. I don't know if they approved the other ones, because they didn't happen nearly as long. But it is just interesting to see this phenomenon of unknown light sources appearing on top of Egyptian churches and people thinking it's the Virgin Mary for that reason. So, if I was a skeptic, I think it'd be really difficult to strain not only why it would happen in Zeitoun, but in many cases. So, and same with Protestants, right? And even as a Protestant, I'm not overly comfortable. One part of me is happy because it's like, oh, there's a really good example of like a supernatural phenomenon, take that, atheist. But on the other hand, it had to be the one that had high Mariology. So it's kind of a weird.
And I mean, if you really think about it, all of the apostolic churches had very high Mariology. I mean, that says a lot. The Coptic Orthodox, of course, the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. I mean, that's pretty significant. It's pretty powerful. But I was aware about favorable responses to Zeitoun. I don't know about the last one you mentioned, but in terms of officially approving it, I don't think the Catholic Church. I think from what I recall, and you're the expert, you could tell me, in my very limited time looking into it, as far as I remember, I don't remember which pope, but I remember one of the popes said that it was up to the Coptic Orthodox Church to decide whether or not they wanted to approve that. Do you know what pope said that, or am I?
It probably would have been the one contemporaneous with that. I don't remember who was pope in 68. Okay. So maybe it was him. I can't recall off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Gotcha.
So it is really interesting though, just to see the reactions to that. I do know that I'm talking to some of my other Protestant friends. I've been told some of them do the demon thing, but more common. I know one of them who said he thought it was an angel, and was like, oh, maybe it's like oh, I could see that because you could see it kind of looking like that. But there are other weird things. Okay.
I think it was Paul. I think it was Pope Paul VI. I'm pretty positive it was him. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So, I think when we're looking at this, when I was debating Darren Slade and John Loftus on this, I brought this up, and they had.
Oh, you did? I got to watch that debate.
Well, we were debating the virgin birth, and Jimmy Akin was talking about the Bible, and I was giving a Marian Apparitions argument. It's kind of funny. So go watch it for the context. But he had said, one of the atheists had said, well, how do we know it's not the Egyptian god Isis? And it's one of those things where it's like, on the one hand, like, yes, this figure didn't identify itself, so it's not that. But the context in which it happened, this was St. Mary's Church in a place that's traditionally ascribed to Mary. It seems weird to think that if God was trying to communicate a message, that he would just let everyone falsely believe in this apparition being Mary and not care. I mean, I'm not saying that's impossible. He doesn't have to come down to correct every false doctrine. But if you think this is from God and not from the devil, which I don't think is from the devil, I think that's stretching for the devil to convert Muslim to Coptic Christianity is very weird. I don't think he's doing his job right there. But for that to happen, if you think this is from God, but God didn't feel the need to communicate this as being, an angel or something. He's like, oh, they can think it's Mary if they want it, even though it's not. It seems very ad hoc to just not go with the simplest answer in that sense, right? But the simplest answer is also weird. I mean, you have the idea that this being looks like the traditional view of Mary, right? Like no one knows what the Virgin Mary actually looked like. We have later depictions, but when you look at the hood and the halo, it does look kind of like what she looks like in paintings. So
no doubt.
Is that evidence that this is just us projecting cultural things on our minds, or is Mary taking the form of someone so she's recognized? There are actually Catholic apologists who use that. And with most Marian apparitions, she actually does look like the people who see her. Some people say that's because that shows that they're hallucinations that are culturally developed. And some people say, oh, no, that's Mary communicating with people in a way they understand. Like if you look at Our Lady of Guadalupe, she appears like a Latina woman or a mestizo woman.
Correct.
If you look at Lourdes, she looks like she's almost like the same age as Burnett, like 19, really young girl in white. You're almost European, right? And then there's one, I forget the name of it, in Africa where she looks like a Black woman. So it's, is it that people are projecting their own cultural biases on this, or is it that Mary is appearing to people in a way where they can identify her and recognize her? Yeah.
Right. They can relate to her. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think a skeptic could use that as ammunition and say that this is like evidence that it's not real. And I think that's partially correct, but it sort of depends. I will say, though, with Christic visions, with Jesus apparitions, as far as I've read on them, weirdly, they don't have that problem. They're actually pretty consistent. In almost every, I mean, you get different like facial details and stuff, but in almost every case of a Christic apparition, at least the veridical ones, I'm not going to count
right
all of them, but the ones that are like veridical, he's almost always described as wearing white and being surrounded by light, right? Which is consistent with their traditional depictions of him.
No doubt.
But even Muslims see him in that way, which is really interesting because they don't have as much exposure to sort of the iconography as like Christians or Catholics would. And in the Hadith, it actually talks about Jesus wearing a saffron orange robe. So it is interesting to me that they see Jesus as wearing white and not as wearing orange, which is what they would probably be more familiar with in their text. So that to me is kind of interesting, where it's like, how is it so consistent over all these different cultures? But Mary is not as consistent. So I don't know if that's a comparison or if that's evidence against Marian apparitions or what, but it is interesting.
But your opinion, you still think there is enough verifiable information to say that these are legitimate, the ones that you have rock solid studied and the ones that you've presented?
I think so. I mean, again, maybe I admit that I have a theological bias, as does everyone. And I think that one could say in some of these cases they're hallucinations or extensions or lies or whatever. But I do think with some of them, like Zeitoun, it's very hard to find a good, plausible, natural explanation to it.
That's pretty powerful.
You combine it with these, I think so. And when you combine it with these other cases where there's good healings towards them, it kind of weighs the probability. And so if you're looking at this as a hypothesis, would you expect these things if atheism was true, the other ones were true? Probably not. But would you expect them if Catholicism or Christianity was true? Probably. But the reason why, I mean, we're not going to make this a whole show of why I'm not Catholic, but
sure.
I have other reservations. But I think one thing that, if you want my personal interpretation, because I do get that question a lot in terms of how.
You jumped ahead. You knew I was going to go there.
Yeah. You were waiting for the kill to just pounce on, and I was trying to beat you to the punch. Yeah,
you got me.
If you want my opinion, the way that I'm currently working this out in my head, and obviously I'm willing to change my mind to this, is that I think that if God wants to do miracles, he's trying to revitalize Christianity in a way that people are most familiar with. So what I mean by that is that Marian apparitions, at least the big ones, the main Fatima, Medjugorje, Zeitoun, Lourdes, most of these occur in a context that were mostly secular, or at least very anti-Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. They weren't in a context, generally speaking, where people were already very much prone to believe in them. Lourdes was right after the French Revolution, so France was very much anti-Catholic. They didn't like the church. And Fatima was very much, you probably know, was very communist. They they were trying to oppress Catholicism. The girls were threatened with being killed. They were so was Lourdes too. She was threatened with being put in jail, usually high persecution. Medjugorje was a communist country. Zeitoun was a mostly Muslim country. These were in pretty hostile environments. And yet these apparitions spark these huge religious movements even today where Portugal and France are pretty secular, these are still major pilgrimage sites that people go to. Millions of people visit every year. It was Guadalupe as well. It was mostly native Aztecs and converted millions of people to Catholicism. So you see these big movements converting to Christianity in a secular context, right? So I think when you have that, if God's going to revitalize Christianity in these countries, he's using the Christianity they're most familiar with. So historically, these countries were Catholic or Zeitoun, they were Coptic. So that's why in Egypt, he does it from a Coptic approach. In Portugal, he does it from a Catholic approach. And if you look at Protestant miracles, especially Pentecostals, a lot of that is growing, especially in the third world, in Asia and Africa. And there's lots of miracles that allegedly happen here, and it's converting people to charismatic Christianity. In fact, Pentecostalism is actually the biggest branch of Protestantism.
Oh yeah, I know
which
that.
is crazy. It's also great. It's also one of the most recent ones too, because it's only been around since about 1900, and it's already the biggest one. So it's actually pretty crazy that it's outpaced Lutheranism and Baptism, all that by centuries that they got on it. So huge growth in Pentecostal Christianity partially because of signs and wonders. So
it's big in Mexico as well, in Hispanic community. It's enormous.
And it is. And it's funny because Mexico is very Catholic. So does it go both ways? Or why, if these are, is God letting the Protestants, the Pentecostals convert to the Catholics, So I see it as, I hold the mere Christianity. I personally see it as God is doing this just to revitalize Christianity across the world. And he's using whatever denomination is most available to those people. He doesn't really care about having to give the correct one to these people, so long as he gives them access to Christianity simpliciter, right? That's why I think that he uses Mary in those contexts, and I think he uses Pentecostals in other contexts that are not very Catholic. So
why no Marian apparitions in Protestantism? It's a question that is.
But I don't think Protestants would be receptive to it, right? I think that they would probably reject it and would think that it would. I mean, sure, Mary could come down and say, "Guys, you have it wrong. The Catholics are right." If Mary came down and did that explicitly, I would convert tomorrow, but that way. Right. But it goes both ways, right? So obviously you have the magisterium and all that stuff. So maybe that's enough authority for you. But I don't know. But you don't typically have Mary. As far as I know, there aren't really many cases of Protestants converting because they saw a Marian apparition. Not that I know of. I mean, like Zeitoun, you had Muslims converted to Coptic Christianity, but they weren't Protestants. So I'm not aware of on a large scale of Protestants who convert in that context because Marian apparitions. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know of any Protestant who's claimed to see a Marian apparition in that sense. So
I don't know. I know a massive amount of conversions in general, not really just from Protestantism, from Our Lady of Guadalupe, but I don't think it was generally from Protestantism. But so you bring up a good point there. Now, as a Catholic, I am nowhere near your level of expertise, but one thing that I would point out that I think really does lend a lot of credibility to the apostolic case is that whether you look at Our Lady of Zeitoun or any of these apparitions. Now, some of them are not Catholic, some of them are Coptic, and as you pointed out, there are different approaches. Other religions where there are Marian apparitions, but the one thing that I see in common with all of these Marian apparitions is that they're occurring to apostolic churches. So the divide between us is not great at all, because I'm thinking of Marian apparitions and all of these churches. We all share the same belief in the Holy Eucharist. The classical Marian dogmas are there: Mary's sinlessness, perpetual virginity, Mary, Mother of God, Mary, the Assumption of Mary. And there is so much in common that we share on the apostolic faith, way more than there are differences. I think it's pretty powerful. So as a Catholic, I would utilize that as an apologetic argument. Do you think that has any value at all? Or do you say, William, that's too weak, I'm going to poke all these holes through it? You're the expert.
I think it's a argument I think that it has some force, because you are right. Okay. The difference between Coptics and Catholics is, compared to a Baptist, is not a big difference at all. They're way more high church, way more high of a Mariology, of a Christology, of all the other ologies, right? So, so I think that's why most Catholics I know aren't really concerned about the Coptic aspect of it. Because it's they're close enough. It's still,
Right. Yeah.
And maybe because the Egyptian setting that she's just working with that, but she didn't explicitly come down and say, Coptic Christianity is correct or anything.
There you go.
That, where she
There
does
you
in the
go.
other one. So yeah, so you could say all that. I think that's fair. But again, I think we're just talking about apparitions, and yes, that is evidence for those denominations. But
Gotcha.
again, I think if you're going to say, do Protestant miracles that convert people to Pentecostal Christianity or what have you, are those evidence for that as well? Now you could say maybe God's just having mercy on people, maybe
Sure.
he doesn't doing that. And you could say that. But again, if you have cases of people who go to a particular charismatic healer and get healed, they're going to be very fervently converted. I know of cases of people who were Catholics, maybe nominal Catholics,
Sure.
but Catholics who went to, in fact, there was one in the 70s that was pretty well known have you heard of Catherine Kuhlman before?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, she was a big faith healer back in probably the 40s to the 70s. Big ministry, was charismatic. And there was a girl named Lisa Larios who her family was Catholic. I don't know how devout they were, but she'd been diagnosed with a particular hip cancer that was going to kill her. And she was in a wheelchair, and she goes to Kuhlman, is instantly healed. And we have the x-rays of it. Right. But anyway, so obviously her family converts to Protestantism and becomes very devout after that. So, in that case, it's like, well, maybe God was just having mercy on her, but why not have her go to a priest and get healed? So you could, but is God going to withhold it just because of that? So it's a lot of difficulty. But again, if you have this figure, if we're just granting for the sake of the argument that this person really could do miracles occasionally, that they have to get healing or whatever, and she has a ministry that influences millions of people, and she's giving teachings on Protestant dogmas. I mean, she has a picture of the Pope. She was very like Catholic friendly, granted, but what she was teaching, I mean, I don't think she like held the transubstantiation. I think she wasn't actually like telling people to become Catholic or anything.
Sure.
Yeah, she was a Catholic friendly Protestant. But anyway, like if maybe God can use someone like that to do great things. But again, is the implication that he's vindicating her through this, that, because I was healed by Kuhlman, I have to now take her words as authoritative and
like as dogma. Yeah.
As dogma. And that's what makes it hard, because you could say the same thing. It's like, well, maybe I prayed and Marian was healed, but was that me saying that I should hold the authority of the Catholic Church, or is that just God being generous? You could ask the same thing with Kuhlman and everything else. So I think that's a difficult question. And that's why I think there's still some hesitancy in terms of how do we interpret these things, right?
Sure. Yeah. Great point. Fantastic point. Well, you might take in a few questions before we wrap it up.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let me go to see if I can find it. Castle Ryan, thank you for the super chat, brother. God bless you. So this is going to be directed to you because I'm not the expert. Have you ever looked at the apparition image of Our Lady of Las Lajas? There's no paint, dye, or pigment. Core samples show the image goes several feet deep inside the rock. Have you ever looked at that?
I don't think I've ever heard of that one before. But I will say, generally speaking, with things like bleeding statues or weeping statues, or even like the Guadalupe image, I have not been overly impressed with some of the, people will make very dramatic claims like, oh, this thing bled human blood, and they looked into it. But when you actually look at the primary sources, it's a lot less impressive, and a lot of it's sort of spread online the internet. I don't know about this particular one, so I could be wrong in that. But generally speaking, when it has to do with like a miraculous image appearing, there's usually a lot of I have quite a lot of skepticism for that. I also see that you have is that the Shroud of Turin in your background?
I do. It was given to me as a gift. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah. I'm also agnostic on the Shroud of Turin. I actually do lean against it being authentic. A lot of people like me saying that are disappointed. I know that
I did for many years. I changed maybe about 5 years ago. I leaned towards it being authentic, but I have gone.
And I have a good friend named Dale Glover who is like he's a layman like me, but he's written probably close to 1,000 pages on it. He knows every study. He thinks it's authentic, but
he does. Okay.
Yeah. So he knows where to do. So maybe you could have him on your show sometime. If you
I'd love to.
That. But
you got to get me in touch.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely will. He's a great guy, but I'm still on the fence about it. I think there's just a lot of objections, and it's hard to really look at it in detail because it gets so technical. You have to be an expert in like 5 different fields of medieval artwork and with radiology and all these other things, and it's a tennis match, right? So it's like for every study that says that, they have a counter study, and it's complicated. So I'm not saying that I know it's fake, but it is contentious. So that's on the point of miraculous images, though. So
now you got to tread carefully in this one.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on Our Lady of Guadalupe and the imprinted image on the cloak? Have you studied it in depth? And what are your particular thoughts? Now, this is an area where I have the only amount of research I've done is from people that have done presentations that I think are incredible. My level of research, my only level, and this research does go deep, but it is only on the historicity of Saint Juan Diego. That's it. That was challenged to me a few years back, and I did heavy research, and I'm convinced he did exist. There's ancient documentation for it. But outside of that, my problem, I'll tell you what my problem is. My problem is you then run into these web pages that make fantastical claims that experts don't make.
Right.
They'll make claims
that drastically exaggerate what was actually claimed or something.
Right. So I have no issue with Our Lady of Guadalupe. I have issue with web pages that present misinformation, and that not even the experts that believe in Our Lady of Guadalupe and present it strongly, not even they use those arguments or say them. That is when I have a problem, when you then get into the fantastical that are incorrect. What are your thoughts in general on it?
Yeah, I'm skeptical of it. I know you mentioned Juan Diego. I think that was one reason. I know that there have been people who recently argued he did exist, but as far as I know, unless you can correct me, I don't know if there's any primary documentation of the actual apparition. Is there? I thought it was at least
okay. So as far as the actual apparition, no. But as far as his historical existence, there's plenty.
Sure, his existence I'm fine with, but in terms of the story about him getting the tilma and it appearing on that, I think that I don't know if there's really good historical sources of like people at the time claimed that it might be a later tradition as far as
I believe it is a little bit later than the actual historical evidence of his existence. Now, when we do arrive at it, though, here's the one thing that we do have an explosion in it. So that definitely has got to be in favor of it. So, I think that there's good evidence. There's a great book put out by a couple that covered this, The Flower World Prophecy. Highly recommend that. I did a show with those two people who, believe it or not, they're two Catholics, a Catholic couple, and they were commissioned to write a book on Our Lady of Guadalupe, and they started out as unbelievers. They didn't believe in it. They said, man, we don't believe. And I think they spent several years working on it I think midway through working on the evidence, they believed in it and they became very convinced with the historical evidence. I have not done that heavy work. I haven't done that heavy research.
Yeah, and I haven't done it as much as I would like to, because again, I do so much.
Yes, no doubt.
So I don't focus as much on that as the stuff. But I will say, from the claims I've seen, like a lot of it is the tilma is miraculous because it hasn't aged like it normally would. Cactus fiber, and the image isn't painted. Although now people admit that there are editions where it's been touched up, painted, but the original one might not have been painted or something. And there's a lot of these are sort of scientifically either conjectural or dubious. Like there was even one that I saw online that I don't think was even claimed in an original document, where it's like they put a stethoscope up and they could hear a heartbeat or something, where it's not even like the experts.
That becomes fantastical. Yeah, that becomes
where it's almost too good to be true in that sense.
And in fact, that particular that was debunked by a number of Catholic Mexican priests. They came out and said, "Look, we believe in it. We believe the tilma is authentic. We believe all of this. You don't need to make up stuff. You're hurting the cause, because then people are going to realize you're making up stuff, and then you're going to put in doubt their belief in general." Things like that, of course, I think that those are the things that I'm talking about that I've run into and I have found to be problematic. But I echo what Georgina says here. From what I have researched, I do believe that the tilma is authentic. But of course, I'd love to talk about that more. Study about that more. It's an area where I haven't done a lot of research.
Yeah, I would need to look more into it. I know that Joe Nickell had a long article where he addressed all the concerns. Yeah, no, I'm not the biggest fan of Joe Nickell. I've had to respond to him a couple of times on some things. So sometimes he doesn't always do the most thorough work. But from reading his article and the sources he cites, I was relatively convinced, this does seem like it, even if it's authentic, it's like the Turin where you have to there's a lot of objections to deal with in terms of this stuff. And a lot of it just gets too technical to where, again, it's like, I don't know at this point with that. It's like, because you can always say, well, here's how you respond to that. It's like with the carbon dating the shroud, there are different objections to it, but it gets kind of complicated when you have to other out. So it's not impossible, but it is. I am very much skeptical of it. I think the shroud Turin is probably better evidence than the tilma, in my opinion. Gotcha. I think it's been scrutinized more, but Yeah.
Gotcha. So you're of the opinion that you say it could be authentic. Maybe some areas have been touched up. In general, it could be authentic, but I would like to do more research. Are you?
Yeah, I would be very hesitant to make I'm not as confident on it as I would be towards like Zeitoun or something.
Gotcha.
Like that.
Gotcha. Okay, understood. Now, I think you answered this for the audience earlier. By the way, Castman, thank you for the super chat. Does the apparition of Our Lady, I think you were trying to say, does it undercut the Catholic Church being the true church? Now, even though you're not Catholic, I think you answered it by saying that, hey, it's general apparition without any general message saying, hey, this Coptic Orthodoxy is true, Catholicism is not. That is why the Pope Paul VI, had no negative reservations. He said that he received pure favorable responses, but it was up to the Coptic Orthodox Church to decide if it was real or not. So no, it would not undercut the Catholic Church as a true church. I think you mentioned that, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. And it's funny because I guess to put you on the spot a little bit, since I always get asked about like how do you do it? How would you? Because one of the criteria they do it when they're looking at Marian apparitions is a theological message. I think there was one, I forget which one it was, one of the obscure ones where the apparition told someone that the Immaculate Conception was false, and the church was like, "Well, that's clearly not true," so they rejected it. Right
now, which one was that? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. It's not a very well known one from what I recall. But
I think I know which one.
Yeah, maybe, but it was pretty widely rejected. But the point that gets at, though, is to say when we look at revelation and miracles, is there hypothetically a revelation or an apparition that could convince you of the thought? Like if we had tomorrow a great apparition in Coptic Orthodoxy that appeared and explicitly said, "Hey, this is correct. Repent, you Protestants, repent, you Catholics, and turn to Orthodoxy." Would that be compelling evidence to you, or would you say, well, given the dogma of the Catholic Church, we should dismiss this as a false sign? Maybe it's demonic or something.
Yeah.
Or you're saying like, what point would you say, well, what point would you be willing to change your own theology based on the evidence versus letting your theology interpret the evidence for you? And that's a hard question.
Man, it's a tough one because it would, in my opinion, it would really undercut not only the biblical evidence that I've spent many years studying, but the evidence from the early church fathers as well. Mm-hmm. It would have to be a doozy, and I just I don't think it would happen. Number one, I think it's impossible. And the other point, man, I hate that you put me in the spot here because I did so much research on this, and I wish I could pull it up, man, because and I did a lot of research on this for debate. There was a supposed recorded apparition, and I forget her name. What is her name? Saint Bridget, I think. It might have been Saint Bridget. I'm trying to remember who it was, to where apparently the apparition, and you may know better than me, Our Lady said, denied the Immaculate Conception in the apparition.
Maybe that's the one I was thinking of. Then.
I think it is.
The name.
I think Bridget. I don't remember. I've got it in my notes. I'd have to go back to the notes. I think it is Bridget. But I remember what I did immediately was I said, okay, I got to dig into this. And it turns out that this supposed denial, this apparition of Our Lady denying the Immaculate Conception, does not exist in any of the primary works of that individual. And later on, biographers of that saint deny it as being a forgery. And I did deep research onto it, and I was able to debunk that. The only reason I even did that was because it became a popular Protestant argument to use in debates on the Immaculate Conception. I was having a debate in the Immaculate Conception. They said, I got to dive in. I got to do the research. And I was able to debunk that. I don't remember the name of that particular saint, though. I wish I could. Yeah.
Well, and even if you couldn't have debunked it, it's like you have one that denies it and how many hundreds that confirm it. So it seems like obviously Protestants will be picking and choosing to say oh, that's the one that you should trust or something, But yeah, that's a good point. It is interesting to see that, but it is a difficult question, and that's why we're discussing it. And I asked that for myself as too, because I think I'm open-minded, and if there was a really compelling Marian apparition that explicitly said, it doesn't have to be to me, but if I was convinced that, like was saying, like Catholicism is true, I would seriously consider that. But you are absolutely right. We have to take other theological considerations into mind in terms of that. For example, we don't have to get into this, but another reason why Fatima, among other reasons why I'm skeptical of it, is that the whole idea of penance and the visions of hell, I don't hold necessarily to a traditional view, like eternal conscious torment view of hell. So that to me seems very much sort of induced. And there's even a case of, this isn't with an apparition, but I also wrote a paper on this in academia, if you're curious, of a modern day resurrection case that happened in a Pentecostal context in 2001.
I think I'd heard of that.
Yeah, and he came back. It was in Nigeria, and he came back and he talked about seeing hell and all this other stuff. And I think the evidence for the actual like resurrection is pretty good. It's really, I go through in the paper all the potential natural explanations, and I don't think any of them are very plausible. But I also talk about how theologically I am kind of concerned about some of the stuff that he was reporting, and so it's like I am a little bit uncomfortable.
Gotcha.
Fine, I think I like making people uncomfortable because I think making people
good. You got to get out of your comfort zone and do research and study. Yeah. And for people that are wondering, yes, the brother here is skeptical of Fatima, but we're working on putting together a round table with the brother here, Caleb, and in my estimation, the very best expert on Fatima, Kevin Simons, and I'm looking forward to doing that, God willing, pretty soon. That'll be fun. You all can just sit down and talk about it.
See if you can get Tyler McNabb on there too. He might be able to
get me. Now him, I don't know him. Get me in touch with him.
He wrote a paper that Simons cites, but Tyler's good friends with Cameron, so I think Cameron can get in touch with him pretty easily. Okay, very, very cool, awesome. Now, in your estimation, is Tyler? Wait, hold on. Let me ask you: is Tyler your friend? No, I don't think I've ever.
Okay, you can answer this honestly.
YouTube, I've taught comments. I don't think I've ever actually had a.
So you can answer this honestly. Who do you think is better between the two?
I haven't read enough of Kevin to know strongly. I just know Tyler's an analytic philosopher who's really smart and I've read his paper. I haven't read any of Kevin's stuff yet, so I don't have an opinion on that.
And you're tough to want to take two of them on. You're tough to want to take two of them on.
I think so. I think I think it's good to have a balance of
no doubt
skeptic and all that stuff.
Yes. No, 100%. I definitely agree with you. Let's take two more before we wrap it up. Before I give you time to put in a plug for anything that you want to plug. Now, interesting that you bring up eternal conscious torment. I'm going to be debating that topic in March. I'm going to be. Have you ever debated that? You debate. You love to debate.
Do you know Chris Date at all?
I know him very well.
Okay, yeah. I actually had the debate with him on a couple of years ago now. I actually hold to. I don't get too off topic here, but I do lean towards more of a Christian universalist view of hell. So
so you differ from him as well, then?
Yeah, no, we were debating annihilationism versus universalism. So I would be more in line with Origin of Alexandria or Gregory of Nyssa, some of those views of apoptosis. But that was actually one of my favorite debates. I've done debates with atheists. That's one of the only ones I've done with another Christian. And I really enjoyed it. And also because Chris knows his stuff on that. This is like his whole ministry. So that was a lot of preparation. And he told me that I was the best debater universalist he ever talked to. And that's including scholars that who are actually theologians who debated on that. He said that I did the best.
I got to have you on and talk about it.
Very flattering.
I got to have you on and talk about it. I do not agree with it. I don't.
I'm sure you don't. Yeah,
not at all.
I was going to joke and say that you're a dogmatic.
And I don't even. And I also don't agree on St. Gregory of Nyssa being a universalist.
Oh, you don't agree with that interpretation?
No, and there's some scholars that have come out and disagreed. But I'd love to talk to you about it.
Sure. Can I ask you? Is that scriptural grounds, philosophical grounds, or both?
Both.
Okay.
I think both. Particularly because I think some of those texts get really misinterpreted. But hey, they there are scholars that disagree with me, and then there's some that
and there are Catholic scholars who don't affirm it positively, but they are the hopeful universalists. They're like, well,
sure,
dogma doesn't. We have to be open that hell could exist, but it doesn't explicitly say that. There's no dogma that says this person must be in hell. I don't think there's anything 100%. That affirms that absolute certainty. So
no doubt.
You can say that we would hope that no one is and that it's possible, but we can't just say that positively that no one is. Yeah.
Right. That's a great point. We got to talk about this, man. You're a brainiac. I'm glad the brother Cameron put us in touch, brother. I'm glad.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
That's awesome. Yeah, let's take two more, and out of respect for your time.
Sure.
Hannah. Asking out of ignorance, if this is obvious, but does the Catholic Church also have, has the Catholic Church meticulously confirmed Christ apparitions like Mary or the miracles? I don't know about this at all.
That's a good question. In the medieval period, there were a lot more Christic apparitions. They were more common. I think within the modern, since the 19th century, there's not as many, at least high profile Christic apparitions, but you do see that in medieval literature, people having visions of Jesus during the Passion, on the cross or appearing to them. I think, I'm blanking on, do you know what her name is? Who, Polish, I think she was a Polish nun who wrote who she did the Mercy Image. I'm blanking on what her name is. Do you know what I'm talking about? Faustina.
I think Sister Faustina. Yeah.
Faustina, yeah, did the
Sister
mercy.
Maria Faustina.
I believe she had a Christophany where she
did
made her draw that.
She did,
but
yes.
I don't know I don't know that was like investigated super thoroughly or what the criteria was. So
I think there are way more Eucharistic miracles that are right.
I did a blog article on that too. I did. Yeah, I am skeptical of those as well.
Do you believe in any of them, or you're skeptical of all of them?
I think Sokolka in Poland was one of the more interesting ones, but a lot of them. I think the problem with it, just to get, I know we're covering like 1,000 topics here, it's fine. But briefly, I think my thing with the Eucharistic miracles is I don't think that they're as scrutinized, because when you have like Lourdes or the canonization ones, this is peer reviewed and they get dozens and dozens of people to look onto this. Same with like the Shroud Turin. And have a lot of debates. With most of these Eucharistic miracles, they go to the bishop. The bishop picks one or two scientists who then goes and does this and writes a statement. But they don't usually have it where this is peer reviewed and people can critique it. And so you have to wonder how the interpretations of one of the scientists said they saw this. It's like when you look at the shroud and they make claims about it, and then the skeptics say, well, no, that's actually not a paintbrush mark or something, or that's actually not the teeth you can see through the X-ray or whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of it's sort of interpretive. So I do wonder how much of that's there, and it's because that we don't have dozens and dozens of people being as a team, like going through this and debating like you would at the Shroud or something. I think I'm much more skeptical that they're not being as scrupulous. And as far as I know, I don't think the church has ever actually affirmed any particular Eucharistic miracle as true in the same way they have with canonization miracles. I think as a Catholic, as far as I know, you're allowed to dogmatically disagree with all. You could say all Eucharistic miracles are false and still be fine.
I don't know about that. You might be right. I've never done very deep research in that.
Well, you have to affirm transubstantiation, but not.
No doubt. Oh, no doubt. You can't deny transubstantiation. But in terms of actual Eucharistic miracles, that's a great question. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, as far as I know, I think you can deny any contemporary. You could deny Fatima or deny any particular miracle, modern day miracle. You can't deny like Jesus's, but any modern day miracle and still be Catholic. You can't deny that the person's like a saint, but you could say like, I don't think that this particular one is a miracle, but they're still, I take it on faith in heaven or whatever. Like you can say that.
Sure. Private revelation, no doubt. Sure. I'm just wondering about Eucharistic miracles. I got to dig into that. But of course, again, and you're right about that. Private revelation, we're not bound to it dogmatically. But aside from it being private revelation, I wonder what level of authority the magisterium has put behind Eucharistic miracles. I'll ask somebody that might know.
Well, I will just say that the Pope Francis did one of them back when he was a bishop in, I think it was the 90s in Argentina, Buenos Aires. He was the one who led the investigation on that. But I haven't hardly heard him talk about it. Gotcha. So it's not as apologetically useful as you think it would be. You think those would be like used everywhere, but it's kind of weird to me how Catholics, I mean, Protestants too, but especially Catholics don't really. This has changed more recently, but they haven't really had as much defense of that as you think that they would. You think this would be like their go-to. So I don't know.
Yeah. Great points. Great points. I do want to give you a chance to plug in anything, brother. You've been fantastic. You've been great. I'd love for you to plug in anything, your works, webpage, blog, academia, anything. Where can people find you, my friend?
Yeah, so I contribute, it's been a while, granted, but to a blog called Think Christian Theism. So if you do that and look at my name, I've done articles on various topics, some of them on miracles, some of them on the resurrection and historical stuff. I did one of them on Calanda, the amputee miracle we talked about earlier, if you want a shorter version of that. Academia, I have 2 articles. They're not published in journals yet. We'll see if that changes. But right now, there are 2 pretty academic, dense articles. There are lots of footnotes on 2 different miracle cases. One of them is one of the Lourdes cases with the broken leg that I mentioned, and one of them is more about modern day resurrection accounts and looking at any evidence for those. So I don't think on either of those I come away with a strong conclusion affirming or disconfirming them, but I try to be as objective as I can. So those would be the other ones. If you just look me up on any other podcast too, I think I've been enough in this point between you and Cameron and the others where and the good thing is I try to do different presentations every single time. Sure. Anyone you click on, I'll probably have different. I used in this presentation I've done Zeitoun before, but some of the cases I mentioned, I don't think I've done in any other podcast before, and vice versa. So if you want a sampler of what to expect from the published work, just go watch a couple of different podcasts and get an idea of all the different ones we mentioned there. But yeah, look out for the book. I'm hoping it'll be out by this spring or summer. Again, I'm editing it, but work has been really busy. So when you do this as a hobby and not a full-time job, it takes a long time to edit something like that. But yeah, volume 1, Proving Prayer, hopefully will be out soon. And I'll be doing a lot more podcasts when that's out to promote it. So just stay tuned for that. And
we'll definitely got to bring you back to dialogue with Kevin on Our Lady of Fatima. My friend, you've been great. Thank you so much for your time, brother. I greatly appreciate your time, your effort, your amazing work, and you're always welcome here on my channel, my friend. Thank you so much for your time, brother. And I want to say thank you, JT, for the super sticker. God bless you. People have appreciated you. I appreciate you, Caleb. Thank you for your time, my friend.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.
Yeah, God bless you. You have a great evening. And everybody, make sure to let Caleb know you appreciate his work. Fill out the comment section down below for the algorithm. Let him know if you appreciated his presentation. And go check him out everywhere that he pointed to. Make sure you check out his work. Caleb, we'll bring you back soon again, my friend. Thank you for your time, brother.
God bless.
God bless.